The door had not opened in 10 years. 11 feet of black iron set into the side of a mountain, with 4 guards in front of it every day for a decade, which tells you how confident they really were. Officially, the boy behind it was dead. Nobody survives a decade in the Undercroft. That was the entire point of the sentence. So when the seal cracked at dawn on the first day of spring, about 200 people were standing there to watch a corpse fall out. What fell out instead was a 19-year-old in a page's gray robe, who hit the stone on his hands and knees and stayed there because his legs would not hold him. His hair had grown to his waist, and when he finally got his head up and looked at the crowd, he squinted like a man who had forgotten what daylight was for. Grandmaster Orenthal stepped forward. 70 years old, 400 victories, the most powerful man in the empire, wearing white so clean it hurt. "The sentence is served," he said. "You are free, say something, boy, so the record shows you were sane at the end." And Corin Vale, still on his hands and knees, still squinting, said, "Your 8th form is missing a step." 200 people heard that and thought the boy had gone mad in the dark. They started to laugh. Grandmaster Orenthal did not laugh. "Start with the world because the world is the whole problem. The Vellum Order does not rule through armies. It rules because it owns the Undercroft. 60,000 volumes carved into the inside of a mountain, containing every technique, every cure, every method of building, farming, killing, and governing that humanity has ever written down. Which brings us to Corin Vale, 19 years old and the lowest-ranked person in the entire order who was allowed to touch a book. He had exactly one talent, and it was a bad one. He noticed things. And on an ordinary Tuesday in autumn, pushing a cart down the 9th gallery, he noticed that 2 books didn't match. There was an initiate called Bram who'd been failing the standing water form for 14 months. Corin found him behind the kitchens and said, "Try it like this." On the 4th breath, the water in the trough beside him went perfectly, impossibly still, the way nobody had seen it do in 200 years. Bram stared at it, then he started crying, which was awkward for everyone. "I'm not stupid," he said. He spent 11 weeks comparing every old copy against every new one, at night, with a candle on his own. And what he found was worse than drift. He took it to Hallow first. That was the reasonable thing, and it was the mistake. If you want to learn a martial art, you don't find a master. You petition the order, and the order copies out a manual for you. Every copy is made by hand, every copy is checked, every copy is stamped, and every copy is a little bit wrong. And you pay for that copy for the rest of your life. Want a cure for the coughing sickness? Same. Want to build a bridge that doesn't fall down? Same. Nobody could check. That was the beauty of it. To notice the drift, you'd need to compare an old copy to a new one, and the old copies were sealed in a mountain. Techniques that flattened hillsides 400 years ago now cracked a boulder if you were having a good day. Cures that used to work stopped working. Every generation of students was measurably weaker than the last, and every generation was told the same thing. You're not trying hard enough. Think about how convenient that is. An entire empire being told the arts are failing because they personally are lazy. And who tells them that? The people who own the only copies. Corin was 19, and he was the lowest-ranked person in the order who was allowed to touch a book. Not a scribe. Scribes were respectable. A page, which is a fancy word for the person who pushes a cart around and reshelves what everyone else leaves lying about. His parents had both been scribes, both dead 6 years back of the coughing sickness, the one there used to be a cure for. Vale, you're supposed to be on the 4th gallery. I was, then I finished. You cannot have finished. There were 200 returns. There were 206. And I did them in order, which is more than I can say for whoever put a treatise on kidney disease in the weapons section. It was you, wasn't it? Archivist Hallow, 61, tired, permanently ink-stained, the closest thing Corin had to family, closed his eyes briefly. He was mouthy, quick, and incapable of leaving a thing alone. He noticed which masters flinched. He noticed which nobles paid double for a rush copy. He was reshelving a beginner's breathing technique. New copy, fresh ink, being returned by a student who'd given up. And 2 shelves down, waiting to be reshelved, was an original. Year 640. Cracked leather, brittle pages hadn't been touched in living memory. Same book, 4 centuries apart. Corin being Corin opened both. They were 9 lines different. Nothing dramatic. The old one had a passage about where to put your tongue. The old one said to count the breath in 4s, and then, once you'd stopped thinking about it, to stop counting entirely. The new one had all the counting and none of the stopping. He stood in the gallery for a long time with a book in each hand. Then he did the thing that ended his life as he knew it. He tried it. There was an initiate called Bram. Big, kind, slow, humiliated. Failing for 14 months due to be dismissed in the spring, which for a boy with no family meant the road. Bram was suspicious for about 4 minutes, then he did it. Bram stared at it, then he started crying, which was awkward for everyone. "I'm not stupid," he said. "No," said Corin. "I've been for a year, they said I wasn't." "You're not stupid, Bram." Corin was still looking at the water. "The book's wrong." And that sentence, "the book's wrong," is the most dangerous thing anyone had said inside that mountain in 300 years. Because if the book was wrong about the standing water form, what else was it wrong about? He should have stopped. He knew even at the time that he should have stopped. He didn't stop. He spent 11 weeks comparing every old copy he could reach against every new one. At night, with a candle, on his own. And what he found was worse than drift. Drift is random. It skips a word here, a line there, scattered evenly through a text like rain. This wasn't rain, this was surgical. In technique after technique, the same kind of line was missing. Never the flourish, never the poetry. Always the small, boring, load-bearing instruction. The transfer of weight, the moment of exhale, the one ingredient, the line that made the thing actually function. Somebody, at some point, had gone through the manuals and taken out the parts that mattered. He sat on the floor of the 9th gallery at 3 in the morning with 40 books open around him, and thought the thought that got him sealed in a mountain. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this on purpose. He was right. He was also 19, and he had absolutely no idea how far up it went. He took it to Hallow first. That was the reasonable thing, and it was the mistake. He laid the books out. He walked him through it, the breathing form, then the iron root stance, then the fever draft that stopped working around the time his mother caught it. Hallow didn't argue. That was the first bad sign. A man being told nonsense argues. He just got very quiet and closed the books one by one and stacked them. How many people have you shown this to? One initiate. He doesn't understand what he saw, and you have written none of it down. Corin hesitated. I've annotated a little. Hallow put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wood. Burn the annotations, he said. Tonight, go back to the cart. Never say this in a room with a door open. And Corin, and this is the whole tragedy of him, said, No, why? Because it will kill you. That's not a reason. That's a warning. A reason would be somebody explaining why every technique in this mountain has had its spine removed, and you're not explaining, which means you already. He stopped. You already know, Corin said. The old man's silence went on a long time. Burn the annotations, he said again. Corin did not burn the annotations. Instead, 8 days later, he did something breathtakingly stupid. He took it to a master, Master Eileen Farrow, 3rd seat of the order. She had a reputation for honesty, which in an institution like that is roughly the same as a reputation for having a short career. She'd once told him he was too clever to be pushing a cart, which he had taken as encouragement and which had probably been a warning. He showed her the iron root stance. Old copy, new copy, the missing line, she read it twice. Then she went out into the practice yard. And in front of 11 initiates, 2 scribes and a very confused kitchen boy, Eileen Farrow performed the iron root stance as it was written 400 years ago. The yard cracked. Not the flagstone she was standing on. The yard. A line ran out from her heel across 40 feet of stone like a river finding its way downhill. And the wall at the end of it shed a course of bricks. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Eileen Farrow looked at her own foot with an expression Corin never forgot. Not triumph, not even shock. Grief, because she was 54 years old. She had trained every day since she was 6. And she had just found out in public that she had spent her entire life being deliberately kept at 40%. They came for Corin that night. Not guards, that's worth saying. Not soldiers, not enforcers, nobody in armor. 2 clerks and a locksmith at 2 in the morning extremely politely with a lantern. Corin Vale, you're wanted at a hearing. At 2 in the morning, the Grandmaster keeps unusual hours. 2 clerks and a locksmith are walking a 19-year-old down a corridor at 2 in the morning. Before we follow them into that room, you need to know exactly what he found, because the order certainly did. It took him 11 weeks. He did it at night after his shift on the floor with 1 candle and a cart he was supposed to have finished with. And the method was so simple it is almost insulting. He took an old copy off the shelf. He took a new copy off the cart. And he read them side by side, line for line, until they stopped matching. That's it. That's the entire investigation that brought down a 300-year-old institution. A boy with 2 copies of the same book and no reason to be tired yet. In the first week, he found 11 discrepancies and assumed he was making mistakes. In the second week, he found 40 and started writing them down. By the fourth week, he had stopped writing them down individually because there were too many and had started writing down the shape of them instead. That is a completely different activity, and it is the one that gets people sealed in mountains. Because drift is random. If a scribe skips a word here and misreads one there, the errors scatter through a text like rain. They land anywhere. They land on the poetry as often as the instructions. What Corin was looking at did not scatter. In technique after technique, the missing line was doing the same job. Never the flourish, never the description, never the part that makes a manual sound impressive. Always the boring, load-bearing instruction that makes the thing actually function. The transfer of weight, the moment of exhale, the exact temperature, the one ingredient. In 11 weeks he found 411 of them, and not one was an accident. And in the 6th week, he did something worse than finding them, which was that he started testing them. Bramkel was the test. 14 months failing a beginner's breathing form, due to be dismissed in the spring, which for a boy with no family meant the road. And on the 4th breath, with the old version of the instructions, the water went flat as glass. And a boy who had been told for over a year that he was stupid found out that he was not. Corin has said since that if he had stopped there it would have been fine. One boy, one form, one quiet correction behind a kitchen. Nobody would ever have noticed. But Bram, being Bram, was so grateful that he told 4 people. And those 4 people asked him where he'd got it. And Bram, being Bram, told them the truth. By the 8th week, there were 9 initiates behind the kitchens at dusk, and 1 page reading out of a 400-year-old book, and a trough that had started ringing. This is the part people forget when they tell this story. Corin Vale was not caught being clever in private. He was caught running a small, unlicensed school. And in the 9th week, archivist Hallow found the loose sheets in the 9th gallery, because Corin had stopped bothering to hide them. He read them standing up in the dark for about 40 minutes. Then he put them back exactly as he had found them, and went and sat down and did not tell anybody for 6 days. 6 days is a long time for a man who already knows what he is going to do. We now know what he was doing with them, and it was not hesitating. On the 7th day, he told Corin to burn the annotations. And Corin, who had spent 11 weeks proving that the people in charge were lying, decided that this particular person was not, which is the single most expensive mistake in this story. And he made it because the alternative was believing that the only adult who had ever been kind to him was also handling him. 8 days later, he took it to Master Eileen Farrow, and that is where the 11 weeks stopped being a private matter. She read the old copy and the new copy twice each. She asked him 3 questions. She did not ask him a 4th, which he noticed at the time and understood 11 years later. Then Eileen Farrow, 3rd seat of the Vellum Order, walked out into the middle of the practice yard and performed the iron root stance as it was written 400 years ago. And 40 feet of flagstone opened up like a river finding its way downhill, and the wall at the end of it shed a course of bricks. And for about 3 seconds nobody in that yard moved at all. What nobody in that yard saw was that she could not stand up afterwards. She got herself as far as the colonnade on her own because she was 54 and proud and had an audience. She was carried the rest of the way. Corin got in to see her once, on the 2nd evening, for about 4 minutes, before somebody decided that a page did not have business in a master's infirmary. She did not blame him. That's worth saying because it would have been very easy and completely reasonable. She said one thing to him, and it was a warning, and he was too young to hear it properly. She said, "They are not going to argue with you. Watch what they do instead." 9 days later, Eileen Farrow was reassigned to a border post that does not exist, and Corin Vale never saw her again for 11 years. Now, while all of that was happening, let's look at what the order was actually dealing with, because from the inside this was not a scandal about books. It was a solvency problem. The Vellum Order's entire income was licensing. 9 million silver a year from copies made by hand in a mountain nobody else could enter. And every single silver of it depended on one assumption: that the copy you paid for was the same as the original you would never be allowed to see. A page had just demonstrated, in a practice yard in front of 11 initiates, 2 scribes and a very confused kitchen boy, that this was not true. And here is the thing that makes the order genuinely frightening rather than merely greedy. They did not investigate whether he was right. Nobody checked. Nobody compared the manuals. Nobody sent a scribe down to the ninth gallery with 2 copies in an afternoon. In 300 years, that would have taken about 4 hours. Because they already knew. Not all of them, not the initiates, not the scribes, not the enforcers. But the people who mattered had known for a very long time, and their only question was how to make it stop being said out loud. Which brings us back to a 19-year-old being walked down a corridor at 2 in the morning by 2 clerks and a locksmith, extremely politely, with a lantern. No guards, no soldiers, no armor. Because you don't need any of that for a page, and because the entire point of the next hour was that it should look like paperwork. He was not frightened. That's the part he finds hardest to explain afterwards. He was irritated, and he was curious, and somewhere underneath both of those he was pleased because somebody important had finally noticed him. He was 19. He had 411 corrections, 1 very grateful initiate, 1 crippled master, and a stack of loose sheets an old man had read 6 days before anybody else. And in about 40 minutes, he was going to be asked 1 question with 2 answers, both of which were traps, by a man who already had the paperwork drawn up. One more thing about those 11 weeks, because it explains everything he becomes later. He was not angry about the money. 9 million silver a year, extracted from farmers and bricklayers for instructions that had been deliberately broken, and it barely registered with him. He mentions it about twice in 1,000 years. What he could not get past was that somebody had taken a working thing and made it not work, and then written the broken version down, and then copied the broken version out by hand, thousands of times for 300 years. That is not a crime against a population. It's a crime against a book. And Corin Vale, who reshelved for a living and had no other loyalties whatsoever, took it extremely personally. There's a small thing from the 8th week that matters much later. One of the 9 initiates behind the kitchens asked Corin why he was doing it, and he gave a flippant answer, and the initiate pushed. So he gave the real one. He said, "Because somebody wrote this down properly once, and somebody else ruined it, and I can tell which is which, and nobody else can." 995 years later, he says almost exactly the same sentence to a grandmaster in a high hall, and it ends an empire. And a last piece of arithmetic, because the order was doing it too. A page who has found 411 deliberate cuts is a problem you can put in Aldermoor. That's what Aldermoor is for. 60 years of good paper and clerks' questions, and the empire never hears a word. But a page who has already taught it to 9 initiates, and demonstrated it through a 3rd seat in a public yard, is a different category of problem entirely. Because the story is already out. You cannot unteach 9 boys. What you can do is make the source of it disappear so completely that anyone repeating it sounds like they are repeating a rumor about a criminal. And that requires a conviction, not a disappearance. A conviction on a record with a charge on it that has nothing to do with what he actually found. Defacing the archive is a beautiful charge for this, and you should appreciate the craftsmanship. It is technically about books, so it sounds relevant. It is unambiguously a crime, so nobody has to argue about whether the order was wronged. And it makes him a vandal rather than a witness, which means that from that moment, everything he ever says about a manual is the testimony of a man who defaced manuals. Somebody in that order sat down and worked all of that out, and then spent 11 weeks copying a boy's handwriting into 400-year-old books to build the evidence. 11 weeks. Starting, as we now know, 6 days after an old archivist read a stack of loose sheets in the 9th gallery and put them back exactly as he had found them. So when Corin Vale walks into a small windowless room in about 4 minutes and is shown 41 volumes in his own handwriting, he is not being framed on the spot by a panicking institution. On the way through the 11th gallery, he passed a girl of 16 in courier's leathers, carrying a satchel in the opposite direction. She glanced at the clerks. He shrugged at her. She rolled her eyes. That's it. That's the entire first meeting of Corin Vale and Sella Wren. It lasts about a second and a half, and neither of them thinks about it again for 10 years. Except that she will. Constantly, actually. The hearing was not a hearing. It was a small room with no windows, and there were 3 people in it. Here's how justice worked at the top of the Vellum Order. No jury, no advocate. A charge, evidence, and a sentence, all decided by the same man. Corin Vale, page 9th gallery, you are charged with defacing the archive. Corin laughed, actually laughed. With what? Thal turned the document around. It was Corin's annotations, every note he'd made in 11 weeks, written directly into the original manuscripts. He had never done that. He had used loose paper because pages who write in originals get their hands broken. He had never touched an original with a pen in his life. But there it was, his handwriting in 400-year-old books, 41 volumes worth. Somebody had spent 11 weeks copying his notes into the originals as fast as he made them. "That's forged," he said. "It is your hand. It's a copy of my hand. You're the largest employer of professional copyists in the... Do you deny the notes are yours?" And there it was, the trap beautifully built with only one way through it and both exits nailed shut. Say the notes weren't his and he was disowning the only true thing he had. Say they were and he'd defaced the archive. Corin Vale, 19, took the honest exit, which was the wrong one. "The notes are mine," he said, "and every one of them is correct. 60,000 books in that mountain and somebody's cut the heart out of half of them. And you're not asking me how I know. That's interesting, isn't it? That's the part I'd ask about if I were actually finding this out for the first time." The clerk stopped writing. Grandmaster Oren Thal looked at him with an expression that Corin, at 19, read as contempt. He was wrong about that. It took him 1,000 years to work out what it actually was. It was relief. Defacement of the archive is a capital charge, but the order does not execute children. He signed the paper. Sealed custody, the Undercroft, 10 years. Here is what everybody in that mountain knew about the Undercroft sentence. It was not survivable. Not because of monsters or starvation. Food came, water came. The Undercroft was the most protected structure in the Empire. You died in there of the other thing, the silence. Men went in for 2-year sentences and came out unable to speak to another person. The record for a completed sentence was 6 years, and that man spent the rest of his life in a shed, refusing to be indoors. 10 years had never been given before. They walked him down at dawn. The order liked its lessons public. Hallow was there and would not look at him. Bram was there and was openly weeping, which Corin found unbearable. Master Eileen Pharaoh was not there, and would never be seen in the Empire again, which is a story we will come back to. And a 16-year-old courier was there, at the back, holding a satchel, watching a boy her own age get walked into a mountain for saying something true. The iron door was 11 feet high and took 6 men to move. At the threshold, Corin stopped and turned round and looked up at the Grandmaster on the steps above. "How long is it really?" he said. Nobody had told him anything about the inside. Nobody had mentioned time. There was no reason on earth for him to ask that question. For 1 second, the Grandmaster's composure slipped. 10 years, he said. The door closed, and then it was very, very quiet. The first thing he learned about the Undercroft was that it was not dark. Everyone expects dark. But you cannot store books in the dark, and you cannot inspect them in the dark, so the whole mountain was lit. Softly, evenly, permanently, by cold lamps that had been burning without fuel since before the order existed, and which nobody in the order could explain. Because the book that explained them was on the 14th gallery, and nobody had read it in 600 years. Corin would read it, twice, but not for a while. The second thing he learned was the size. 60,000 volumes sounds like a number until you're standing at the bottom of it. 19 galleries cut in rings going down. Ladders, walkways, shelves that ran out past the reach of the lamps. He walked for 2 hours the first day and did not reach the bottom. And when he shouted to hear something, the echo took long enough coming back that he stopped doing it. The third thing he learned took him 11 days, and it broke him. There was a hatch, waist-height iron in the wall beside the door. On his 11th morning it opened and a crate came through. Bread, hard cheese, dried fruit, a skin of water, a wax candle he didn't need. And a note in a bored, blocky hand, delivery one. Sign. He signed, he shoved the slate back through. He put his face against the iron and said, "Hello, can you hear me, please?" The slot closed. He waited for the next one. He counted. He was very careful about the counting because counting was going to be the only thing keeping him a person. The next crate came on his 3,000th day. Let's do that number slowly because he did. He counted 8 years, 2 months, and 11 days between the first delivery and the second. The supply schedule of the Vellum Order was 1 delivery per month. He did the arithmetic 4 separate times, and each time it came out the same, and each time he put it down and picked it up again. 1 month out there, about 8 years in here, 100 to 1, 10 years of sentence, 1,000 years of Corin. He screamed for a while. That's fine, anyone would. He went through the whole catalog over the next several months. Rage, bargaining, a long stretch of not getting up, and an episode with a knife from a food crate that he does not talk about afterward, and neither will we. And then, some time in what he estimated was his 14th year, having exhausted every other option available to a man in a sealed mountain, Corin Vale got extremely, cosmically bored. And that is how the most dangerous ability in the history of the Empire got discovered. Not by a genius, not by a chosen one, by a bored teenager rereading a book because there was nothing else to do. The book was the breathing form, of course it was. The old copy, the book that had ruined his life, the one he'd read to Bram behind the kitchens. He knew it by heart, he could recite it backwards, he read it again anyway. And on the second reading the text did not change. Nothing glowed, no voice spoke. There was no system, no window, no notification, nothing so convenient. What happened was that Corin understood it, not remembered, understood, and the difference is the entire story. On a first reading you learn what a book says. That's what everyone gets. That's why every student in the Empire performs techniques like a man following a recipe in a language he doesn't speak. On the second reading, Corin understood what the book meant. He could see the writer. He could see the room the writer was standing in. He could see the moment where the writer had been reaching for something, and the words had come up short. And he could see, glowing in his head like a splinter, every single place where the text was wrong. Not just the missing line he already knew about. 9 more. A mistranslation in the second paragraph. A unit of measurement that had meant something different 400 years ago. An instruction that had been correct for a person standing on packed earth and was nonsense for a person standing on stone. He sat there with his heart going like a bird. Then he got a fresh sheet of paper and, hands shaking, he wrote out the form as it should be. Not as it was meant. Restored where it was broken. And then, in 4 places, better than it had ever been, because he could see what the author had wanted and the author had not quite managed it. He looked at that page for a long time. Then he went and found a trough of standing water on the 3rd gallery and did the form. And on the 4th breath, the water didn't just go still. It went still and then the whole surface rang like glass. One clear note, and stayed ringing for 11 seconds. Corin Vale, alone in a mountain, sat down on the floor next to a singing trough of water and laughed until he couldn't breathe. He had 60,000 books, he had 1,000 years, and he had just found out what he was for. Let's be clear about the rules, because they matter for everything that follows. 1. First reading, you learn it, same as anyone. You can recite it and perform it badly like every student alive. 2. Second reading, you understand it. Every dropped line, every copying error, every deliberate cut, and the intent behind all of it. 3. From that, he can write the corrected version. Restored, and frequently better than the original because understanding the intent lets you finish the thought. 4. He cannot invent from nothing. This is the hard limit and it never moves. Put him in an empty room and he is a skinny 19-year-old with opinions. 5. Nothing is destroyed. The books stay exactly as they are. He's not stealing anything. He's not eating the archive. Every volume he corrects sits on the shelf, untouched, next to a fresh sheet in his handwriting that says what it should have said. And that is what made him more dangerous than any thief. A thief takes a thing and then you don't have it. Corin was building a second archive, the true one page by page in the same mountain, out of paper the Order had supplied him with. And every sheet of it was a loaded weapon, pointed at the only reason they were in charge. 6 and the counter, 60,000 volumes. He read the first one twice in his 14th year, 986 to go. The second delivery had come, which meant the third would come, which meant that once every 8 years for the rest of his sentence, there was going to be a person on the other side of that slot. He prepared for it the way a man prepares for the only thing that is ever going to happen to him. He worked out what to say. He revised it. He rehearsed it out loud in a mountain alone for the better part of a decade, which sounds funny and is actually one of the saddest things in this story. And when the hatch finally clanked, he was standing there with his hands folded like an idiot, and a voice said, "Delivery 3, sign." A girl's voice bored out of her mind. "Hello," said Corin. There was a pause on the other side. "Sign the slate." I'd like to talk first. There's nothing on the form about talking. There's nothing forbidding it either. I've read the form a great many times. There's a stain on the bottom left corner that I believe is soup. Longer pause, it's tea. It's soup. I've had 8 years to think about it. You've had a month. And Corin Vale, 31 years old and 19 years old at the same time, leaned his forehead against cold iron and shut his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "That's the thing I wanted to talk to you about." Her name was Sella Wren. She was 16, and she was the most junior courier in the Vellum Order, which she wanted everyone to understand was temporary. Her family had no rank. Her mother scrubbed floors in the East Wing. She had applied to the Initiate program 4 times and been rejected 4 times. Always politely, always with the same phrase, insufficient foundation, which is a wonderful thing to tell someone when the reason is that her mother scrubs floors. The Undercroft run was the worst job on the roster. Half a day up a mountain to push bread through a slot at a dead man. She got it because nobody else wanted it. She kept it for 10 years because of what happened on the 4th delivery. On the 4th delivery, Corin didn't say hello. He said, "The breathing form, you've been failing it for 2 years. Silence on the other side of the door, the good kind. How do you know that? Because you sighed when you put the crate down, which means you're tired, which means you've been practicing before your shift, which means you're doing it in secret. And you're 16 and lowborn, and you've applied to the Initiates and been turned down. So it's not a sword form you're grinding at, it's the entry test. Also, you're breathing in 4s. I can hear you through the door. Whoever taught you said count in 4s. That's what the manual says. The manual's wrong. The manual is a copy of something 400 years old, and it has 9 mistakes in it. One of them is that you're supposed to stop counting. Count in 4s until it's automatic. Then stop. The counting is scaffolding. You've been standing there for 2 years holding up scaffolding and wondering why there's no building. Sella Wren stood outside an iron door on the side of a mountain in the cold, holding a delivery slate, and thought several extremely rude things. Then he said, "Prove it. Can't, I'm in a mountain." He sounded amused. "Try it and come back. That's a month." "Yeah," said Corin. "I know exactly how long that is." She came back in a month. He'd been waiting 8 years and 4 months. She didn't say hello either. She said through the door fast like she'd been holding it in the whole climb. It rang. It what? The water in the trough. It went flat and then it rang like glass, 11 seconds. 9. 9's good, 9's very good for a first time. Mine was 11 and I've had considerably more practice. A beat. How'd the test go? Silence. Sella, I haven't taken it. Why not? Because if I take it and pass, they'll ask who taught me. Her voice had gone flat and careful. And the answer is a convict in a hole, isn't it? And there it was, 16 years old, and she'd already worked out the shape of the thing faster than he had at 19. "Yes," said Corin, "so what do I do?" "You lie, you tell them you worked it out yourself. And then, Sella Wren, you are going to have to be extremely, unbelievably good. Because from the moment you pass that test, every person in that order is going to be looking for the reason a floor scrubber's daughter can do something their masters can't." A long pause on the far side of the iron. "Can you teach me more than one?" Corin Vale looked back over his shoulder at 60,000 books, in 19 galleries, going down into a mountain with 1,000 years in front of them. "Yeah," he said, "I think I can manage that. Can you teach me more than one?" That question cost Corin Vale about 40 years of work, and he answered it immediately, and he never once regretted it. Because a lesson every 8 years is not a lesson. It's a message in a bottle. If he wanted her to actually get better, he had to solve a problem no teacher has ever had. How do you teach somebody a physical skill in 4 minutes? Through a wall once every 8 years, when you cannot watch them do it, and they cannot write anything down. His answer, worked out over the first 2 decades, is genuinely the most impressive thing he does in this entire story, and it has nothing to do with the second reading. He stopped teaching techniques. Techniques are too big. A technique is 40 instructions, and she would forget 30 of them on the walk down. So instead he taught her errors, 1 error at a time. Not here is the 5th binding, but here is the single most common way a person gets a rotation wrong, and here is what it feels like when you fix it. 1 correction, in 4 minutes, that applied to 9 different techniques at once. That is how a girl who saw her teacher for 8 hours across a decade ended up outperforming men who trained daily for 40 years. He was not giving her more material. He was giving her better material in the smallest transmissible unit he could find. Delivery 5 was the exhale. Delivery 6 was the weight transfer. Delivery 7 he wasted because he tried to give her 2 things and she got neither, and then he had 8 years to think about that. 8 years is a long time to sit with a teaching mistake. He never made that one again. And on the other side of the wall, a courier was walking down a mountain 11 miles in the cold. repeating one sentence to herself the whole way so she would not lose it. She was not allowed to write it down. She worked out that rule herself in the first year without being told, because she had already understood that paper can be found and a head cannot. Meanwhile, the counter was moving, and it was moving badly. The first book took him 14 years because he had to discover the ability and then work out what it was. The second took a season. The third took a season. The fourth took 9 months because it was in a dialect he didn't have. So he stopped and spent 4 years learning the dialect from the ground up, out of 3 other books, none of which were about anything he needed. That is the pattern of the entire millennium, by the way. Every time he wanted to go faster, the only way through was sideways, into something that looked completely irrelevant. By year 50, he had done 60 books. By year 80, he had done 240, and the rate had roughly quadrupled because the sideways work had started paying. Every dialect he learned made the next 4 books faster. Every dead author he came to know made the next one in that tradition legible. He was not reading a library. He was assembling a key to it. And there is a thing that happens to a man doing that for 80 years alone, that the story has to be honest about. He started losing the difference between the authors and himself, not dramatically. He would finish a correction and not be able to remember whether the improvement had been his idea or the writer's. And after a while, he stopped finding that upsetting, which is arguably worse. He kept himself honest with the trough. Every corrected martial text got tested at the water on the 3rd gallery, because a technique that only works on paper is a technique you have got wrong. He could not perform most of them properly. His body was already going. But he could perform enough of one to know whether the shape of it was right, and the water told him the truth every time. 11 seconds meant correct. 9 meant close. 4 meant he had missed something and had another season of work in front of him. He kept a tally of the failures scratched into the stone beside the trough. By the end, there were 406 of them. And every 8 years the hatch. That was the whole calendar, not seasons, not years, deliveries. Delivery 11, she told him she'd been promoted. Delivery 14, she told him about a boy she liked, and he thought about that conversation for the next 8 years. Delivery 17, she did not come, and a different courier pushed the crate through and would not answer him, and he spent 8 years assuming she was dead. She had a fever for 9 days. That's all. 9 days out there. He grieved for 8 years, and then she said hello and he had to sit down. That is the real cost of the ratio, and it is not the loneliness. It's that every ordinary thing that happens to her lands on him as a catastrophe or a resurrection, because he has had 80 years to imagine it. And the outside world came to him in 4-minute slices, once every 8 years, with enormous gaps in it. He knew the order had a new second seat, but not what happened to the last one. He knew there had been a bad winter, but not how many died. He had a picture of an empire assembled from about 90 sentences, which is worth remembering later, when he walks out of a mountain and starts making decisions about a country he has essentially never seen. By year 120, he had corrected 600 volumes, and he made a decision about the order of the work that turns out to matter enormously. He could have gone gallery by gallery, neat, systematic, easy to track. Instead, he went by how much damage the broken version was doing. Medicine first, then anything structural, bridges, mines, water, walls, then agriculture. The martial texts, which are what the order actually sold, he left until he was 300 years in. So when he finally walks out, the corrected volumes he can hand over first are the ones that stop people dying, and the ones that make the order rich come last. That was not a strategy. He was 120 years old and had no plan to ever leave. He did it because a man dying of a fever seemed more urgent than a master with a weak stance, which is not a complicated thought. It is, however, the single decision that makes the ending possible. If he had gone shelf by shelf, he would have walked out with 11,000 corrected sword manuals and a plague still running. Around delivery 22, year 176, for him, Sella asked him a question through the hatch that he did not have an answer to. She asked what he was going to do when it was finished, and he realized, crouched at an iron slot in a wall, that he had been working for 176 years, without once considering that the work would end. He told her he'd think about it. He thought about it for 819 years and arrived at no conclusion whatsoever, which is the most honest thing in this account. Because the answer, obviously, is that there is nothing after it. He is 19, he will always be 19, and the only structure his life has ever had is a shelf with books on it. The Undercroft did not just preserve his body. It gave him the only thing he has ever been good at and then guaranteed him 1,000 years of it, and he has never had to find out what he is without it. Which is why, when he finds a way out in year 43, and we are getting to that, the decision is not nearly as difficult as it should be. And it is why the note he finds at the very end of all this, 400 years old and still wet enough to smudge, does not frighten him at all. 9 more rooms is not a threat to a man like that. It's a career. But that is 900 years away. Right now he is 176 years old. He has corrected 811 books out of 60,000, and he is about to have the single luckiest accident of his life. Because on a gallery he had no reason to be on, in a book about hydraulic engineering he was only reading because he had run out of anything else. There was a survey. And in the survey there was a footnote about ventilation. And in the ventilation there was a shaft, 14 inches across, running 110 feet to a coin of daylight on the eastern face of the mountain. There is a practical question about the first 100 years that people always ask, and the answer is boring and worth having. What did he eat? A crate every 8 years, containing about a month of food. Which means that for 7 years and 11 months out of every 8, Corin Vale was not eating anything at all, and was not hungry, and did not starve, and did not age, which is the moment you stop thinking of the Undercroft as a building. He tested it in year 61, deliberately, because he had run out of other experiments. He did not eat for 11 months and recorded the results in a notebook. Nothing happened. No weakness, no wasting, no hunger. He simply continued, exactly as preserved as every book on every shelf around him. Which is when he understood properly what the vault was doing. It was not keeping him alive. It was holding him at exactly the state he arrived in, the way it held everything else. He ate anyway when the crates came, not for the body, for the 8 minutes of it being a different activity. And that is the shape of every decision he makes in there after about year 50. Nothing is necessary, everything is chosen, which sounds like freedom and is in fact the opposite. He kept a routine. He did not need one. He built it deliberately in year 22 and never broke it in 973 years. Read in the morning, correct in the afternoon, test at the trough in the evening. Walk 1 full circuit of the 19th gallery before sleep, which took 40 minutes and served no purpose whatsoever, except that a man who stops marking the difference between 1 hour and the next in a place, with no daylight stops, being able to tell 1 century from another, and he had worked that out early. There is a second notebook, from around year 400, that is just the routine written out and then written out again, 40 times in the same hand, getting steadily neater. He has never explained that one and has been asked twice. And once in year 309, he stopped for 11 days. No reading, no correcting, no trough, no circuit. He sat in one place on the 3rd gallery and did absolutely nothing to find out what was underneath the work. On the 11th day, he got up and went back to the 4th gallery and never tried that again. And he has never said what he found, and it is the only thing in 1,000 years he refuses to describe. So when people ask how a man survives 1,000 years alone, the honest answer is that he did not, particularly. He assembled something that could, out of routine and shelving and 4 minutes every 8 years. And what walked out of that mountain was that assembly, wearing a 19-year-old's face. What followed was the strangest apprenticeship in the history of the empire. 1 lesson a month, 4 minutes at a hatch because a courier who lingers gets questioned. She'd shove the crate through, he'd talk fast. She'd repeat it back once. And then she'd be gone up the path with a corrected technique in her head and no paper anywhere on her, because paper can be found. For her, 12 lessons a year. Manageable, roughly what a serious student gets. For him, 1 conversation every 8 years. He prepared for each one for the better part of a decade. He would decide on the technique, correct it, test what he could of it with a ruined body, then break it into pieces small enough to be said out loud in 4 minutes, and remembered by a girl walking down a mountain in the dark. He got very, very good at teaching. He had nothing but time to get good at it. And Cellar Wren started to climb. She passed the entry test at 17, and they made her repeat it because they didn't believe the result. She passed it again, better. At 19, she took the 2nd rank trial and beat a boy who'd been training since he was 5. There was a formal complaint and an inquiry, and the inquiry found nothing because there was nothing to find. She really had done it herself, in the sense that her hands had done it. And the only evidence otherwise was 11 miles up a mountain behind 11 feet of iron. At 21, they gave her a rank they hadn't given to a lowborn in 90 years. At 22, Master Oral Kish, 6th seat, 68 years old, the best pure technician the order had asked her, quietly after a demonstration, where she had learned to exhale at the halfway point of the rotation. And Seller Wren, who was much better at this than Corin had ever been, said, "Is that not what the manual says, Master?" And watched a 68-year-old man go, and read a manual he'd known by heart for 50 years. That was the first crack. Nobody heard it but her. Meanwhile, in the mountain, the counter was moving. 60,000 volumes. By his 40th year, he'd done 400. That's not a good rate. That's a terrible rate, and he knew it. And he had run the arithmetic, and it said he would finish somewhere around year 980 with almost nothing to spare. Because here's the thing nobody understands about the second reading. It is slow. The first read of a book might take a day. The second read could take a season. Understanding is not absorption. It's work. It's sitting with a paragraph for 11 weeks because a word in it means two things, and the difference is the whole technique. It's teaching yourself a dead dialect from 3 other books, so you can read the one you actually want. It's building, in your own head, the entire world the author lived in, because otherwise you cannot see what they were reaching for. He was not skimming a library. He was rebuilding 60,000 human minds, one at a time, from the inside. And in year 41, halfway through a book on hydraulic engineering that he was reading purely because he had run out of martial texts on that gallery, Corin Vale found the way out. It was in a survey, not even a proper book, a builder's survey of the mountain from before the order existed, from when the undercroft had been dug for some other purpose by somebody else entirely. Load-bearing notes, water table, ventilation, and a line about the eastern shafts. The undercroft had to breathe, books rot in still air. So there were shafts, narrow, vertical, cut for airflow, and one of them on the 17th gallery was 14 inches across at its narrowest, and came out on the eastern face of the mountain, 110 feet above a scree slope. 14 inches is not a door. 14 inches is barely a person. But Corin, at that point, weighed almost nothing, and he had, on the 11th gallery, 2 volumes on cave rescue that included the corrected version of a technique for compressing the rib cage. One the order had let die out 3 centuries ago because it had no combat application. He read them both twice. It took him 2 years. And at the end of it, he stood at the bottom of the 17th gallery, looking up a shaft at a coin of daylight 110 feet above him, and understood with total clarity that he could leave. He was 43 years old inside. 5 months had passed outside. He was still 19 in the only way that counted. The undercroft preserved what it stored, and it had been storing him. He could climb out tonight, walk down the eastern scree, and be a nameless boy in a border town by the end of the week. He stood there for 11 days. Let's be honest about what he was actually choosing between, because it wasn't freedom versus books. Out there he'd be 19, illiterate in the world, wanted, with no name he could use and no skill his body could perform. He would spend his life hiding, and he would spend it knowing that 60,000 broken books were sitting in a mountain being copied out wrong. Forever. And that the cure his mother died without was on the 4th gallery, with 9 lines missing. And that he was the only person alive who could see it. In here he had 1,000 years and a job. That's not a choice. That's a man discovering what he is. He climbed back down the ladder. He went to the 4th gallery. He took down the book with the fever draft in it. And he read it a second time, and it took him a year and a half. And when he was finished, he wrote out the correct version of the cure that had killed his parents in his own hand on a clean sheet and set it on the pile. And then he took down the next book. The shaft stayed open. He never sealed it, never disguised it, never told anyone about it. It was there every day for 937 more years. He just didn't take it. Nobody imprisoned Corin Vale after year 43. That's the part you have to carry with you for the rest of this story. Everything he becomes, everything he does to the order, everything he gives to the world, all of it is a choice a 43-year-old man made in a shaft, alone, and then made again every morning for 9 centuries. The door was open the whole time. He stayed because the work wasn't finished. If you've ever wondered what separates a man who is good at something from a man who is consumed by it, it's not talent. It's that. Time does things to a person that a recap can only gesture at. So let's gesture. At 100, he stopped talking to himself because he'd said everything. At 200, he started again, but in the voices of the authors, because he knew them better than he knew anyone alive. He would argue with a dead engineer about drainage for a month at a time. It helped. It was also, obviously, not entirely healthy. At 300, he corrected the last of the martial texts and moved to medicine, and discovered that the order had gutted the medical library worse than anything else. Because a population that can cure itself doesn't need a vellum physician at 40 silver a visit. At 411, he found the passage explaining the cold lamps and laughed for an hour. At 500, he had his only real breakdown. A bad one, 18 months of it, triggered by the realization that Seller Wren, who came to the hatch every 8 years, was going to die. Not soon, not yet. But he was going to outlive everyone he would ever speak to several times over, and the arithmetic of that had finally caught up with him. She talked him out of it in 4 minutes at a hatch, without ever knowing she was doing it, by telling him about a boy she liked. At 600, he began the second archive properly. Not loose sheets anymore, but bound volumes, thousands of them, stacked in the empty part of the 19th gallery. 60,000 books worth of truth, in one man's handwriting, in a hole nobody was allowed into. At 800, his body began, quietly, to fail. Preserved is not the same as healthy. He was 19, and he had not walked more than a mile in 8 centuries, and he began to understand that whatever came out of this mountain was going to be an invalid. He corrected a book on physical rehabilitation, and read it twice and wrote himself a program, and then discovered that a program is not much use to a man with nothing to lift and 900 years of atrophy to undo. He did it anyway, badly, for 200 years. At 984, he shelved the last book on the 18th gallery, and then there was one shelf left. It was at the very bottom in the section reserved for order records, and he had known where it was since his second year. Case 11, third shelf, a single slim volume bound in gray. His own trial. He had read it once, first reading in his second year, the way a wounded man picks at a scab. He knew what it said: charge, evidence, sentence, 2 pages of nothing. He had left it there for 980 years because he was afraid of it, and he was honest enough with himself to admit that. Now there was nothing else left. He took it down. He sat on the floor of the 19th gallery, under a lamp that had been burning since before his empire had a name. And Corin Vale read his own trial for the second time. The second reading of any book shows you the intent behind it. That's the whole ability. You see what the writer was reaching for. He'd used it on 900 years of dead engineers and physicians and swordsmen, and it had shown him drainage and dosages and footwork. Used on a legal record, it showed him something else. It showed him that the trial had been written before it happened. Not the outcome, the whole thing. The phrasing of the charge was 3 weeks older than the charge. The evidence schedule referenced volume numbers for books that had not yet been annotated when the schedule was drawn up. And the sentence, sealed custody, the Undercroft, 10 years, appeared in a hand that had written it slowly. Carefully, the way you write something you have already decided. And underneath it all, in the shape of every choice on every page, the intent came up at him like a face out of deep water. They had not been trying to punish him. They had been trying to put him in here. The whole thing, the forged annotations, the clerks at 2 in the morning, the trap with only one honest exit, built to produce one outcome. A boy with a talent for noticing errors, sealed inside the largest collection of broken books in the world, for 1,000 subjective years. Someone had known what he was. Someone had known what the Undercroft did to a reader, and someone had needed the work done. Corin sat with that for a long time. Then he turned to the signature page because there is always a signature page. 2 signatures. The first was Grandmaster Orenthal's, and the intent behind it was so loud he almost dropped the book. Not malice, not greed, terror. A man signing something he had been told to sign and hating it and doing it anyway. The second signature was smaller and lower in the place where the presenting officer signs. The person who brings the charge. Archivist Denhall Hallow, the old man who had told him to burn the annotations, the closest thing he had to family. The book fell shut. There is no dramatic scene here. He didn't scream. He was 984 years old, and he had done all his screaming somewhere around year 15. He sat on the floor, holding the proof that his entire life had been an errand somebody else set him. And then, because he was who he was, he read the last 16 books on the shelf, twice each, over the following 11 years. Because he had said he would finish, and he was not going to let a betrayal make a liar of him. He put the last one back on the second day of what he calculated was his 995th year. 60,000 volumes, every one twice. Then he walked up to the first gallery and sat down against the wall by the iron door and waited 5 subjective years for a delivery that never came. Because there were no more deliveries, his sentence was over, 10 years to the day. And on the other side of that door, an empire that had spent a decade quietly falling apart was about to get its books back. While Corin Vale was reading the last shelf in the 19th gallery, 10 years were happening out here. And they were not good ones. Start with Sella, because her decade is the only one in this story that goes right. She passed the entry test at 17. They made her sit it again because they did not believe the result, which is a thing that happens to low-born applicants and does not happen to anyone else. She passed it again better, and one of the examiners wrote a note in the margin of her record that she was not supposed to see and did see, because she was a courier and couriers carry records. It said, verify origin of instruction. Nobody ever did. That single unfollowed note is the closest the Vellum Order ever came to catching this in the first 9 years. At 19, she took the second-rank trial against a boy who had trained daily since he was 5, and beat him in under a minute, and did it so cleanly that the complaint filed afterwards was about her technique being wrong. Not too strong, not unfair. Wrong. 3 separate masters wrote that she was performing the 5th binding incorrectly, and every one of them was right, according to the manual. And she stood in front of an inquiry at 19 years old and said, entirely straight-faced, that she must have misread it, which is the most dangerous sentence in the whole first act. Because a girl who misreads a manual and gets better results is a girl who has just told 12 senior people that the manual might be the problem. 11 of them heard an apology. One of them heard exactly what she said. Varric Kest was 34 then, and he was not yet second seat, and he did not act on it for 9 years. He simply kept the note. At 21, they gave her a rank no lowborn had held in 90 years. And her mother, who scrubbed floors in the East Wing, was not invited to the ceremony because there is no provision in the charter for it. She wore the sash to the East Wing that evening and stood in a scullery doorway until somebody noticed, which is the only genuinely happy scene in the first 60 minutes of this story. At 22, Master Oral Kish asked her where she had learned to exhale at the halfway point of the rotation, and went and read a manual he had known by heart for 50 years, and found nothing there. And then, being a decent man, he went and asked his own grandmaster about it. That conversation is not recorded. What is recorded is that Oral Kish retired 4 months later at 68 in good health and moved to the coast. So by the 5th year of Corin's sentence, Orenthal knew that something was loose in his order. He did not know what, and he did not want to, because the only explanations available to him were that his masters were lying, or that his manuals were wrong, and he had signed a paper 11 years earlier that made the second one his problem specifically. Meanwhile, the empire had started to come apart, quietly, in the way that infrastructure does. The Kesson seam was surveyed in the 6th year by an order surveyor who was very good at his job, and using a technique for reading water pressure through rock that had lost its keystone line 2 generations earlier. He declared the seam dry. He was wrong by about 9 feet of standing water, and he did not know he was wrong, and there was no living person who could have told him. 110 men went in on a Tuesday in the 7th year. None of them came out, and it took 9 days to stop the water, and the order sent an investigator who found operator error. There is a line of markers on the hillside above Kesson. Corin has stood in front of it. He does not talk about it. The coughing sickness came back in the 8th year. It had never really gone. It had been managed for 200 years by a draft that worked, and then by a draft that mostly worked, and then by one that did not. The degradation had been gradual enough that nobody could name the year it stopped. Physicians simply found themselves losing patients they used to save, and blamed the strain, and charged the same fee. 4,000 people died in that decade of a disease, with a cure written down on the 4th gallery of a sealed mountain, 9 lines short. Corin's parents had died of it 6 years before he was sealed. He does not find out about the resurgence until a farmhouse conversation 11 subjective centuries later, and when he does, he asks Sella to repeat the number twice. And through all of it, once a month, a courier climbed 11 miles up a mountain and pushed bread through a slot in a door. She kept the run when she made 2nd rank, which raised eyebrows. She kept it when she made 4th seat, which caused an actual argument. A master of the Vellum Order does not carry crates. She said she found the walk useful for thinking, which is true and is not the reason. The reason is that in 10 years she had told exactly nobody where any of it came from. And if she gave up the run, somebody else would be standing at that hatch in a month. and he would say hello. So she carried crates up a mountain for 11 years as a senior master of an institution that would have destroyed her for it, and she never once complained about it in his hearing. And in the last of those years, the deliveries got shorter, not because she had less to say, because he did. Delivery 114, he asked her to describe the sky and then did not speak for the rest of it. Delivery 119, he asked her what she would do if he did not come out. She told him to stop being dramatic. He said he was being actuarial, which is worse, and she thought about that sentence for the following month and could not make it better. And in the 9th year, Varric Kest, now second seat, now running the order's revenue, did the arithmetic that nobody else had bothered to do. Licensing income had fallen 11% in 6 years, not because fewer people were buying, because more of them were coming back to complain, and complaints cost money. He wrote a report. It is 11 pages long, and it is the most dangerous document in the empire, because it says, in the flat language of accountancy, that the product had been deteriorating for 300 years. He gave it to Orenthal, who read it and thanked him, and did not act on it, and did not destroy it either. That report is sitting in a locked drawer in the high hall on the morning. A boy crawls out of a mountain and tells the Grandmaster that his 8th form is missing a step, which is why Thal goes white, not because a madman said something strange, because a released convict had just confirmed in public an 11-page report he had spent a year refusing to think about. So that is the world Corin Vale walked into. A flooded mine, 4,000 graves, a locked drawer, an unfollowed margin note, and one master of the order who had been carrying crates up a mountain for 11 years and telling nobody why. 10 years, 1 month to him between deliveries. And on the first day of spring, at dawn, with 200 people standing on the steps to watch a corpse fall out, somebody finally opened it. There is a detail about the Kessin flood that Corin did not learn until much later, and which changed how he thought about the whole thing. The surveyor who cleared that seam went back down to the valley 11 days after they stopped the water, and stood in front of the markers on the hillside, and then walked into the hills and did not come out. They found him in the spring. He had left a written statement in his lodgings, 4 pages, insisting that the reading had been correct and that he had followed the manual exactly. He was right. That is the horror of it. He had followed the manual exactly, and the manual was 9 lines short, and there was no living person in the empire who could have told him. The Vellum Order recorded his death as a personal failing, and filed the statement without reading past the first page. And there is a similar detail about the plague, which is that the physicians knew. Not the cause, but every provincial physician over the age of 50 had noticed that the draft worked less well than it had when they were young, and 11 of them wrote to the order about it across 2 decades. All 11 letters were answered politely. All 11 answers explained that the strain had changed and recommended increasing the dose, which does nothing, because the missing ingredient is missing at any dose. 4 of those physicians are still alive when Corin walks out of the mountain. 2 of them come to Aldermoor. One of them is 81 and walks 9 days to get there. And Yenna Cardew, who had spent 63 years answering clerks' questions on good paper, met him at the gate and knew his name because she had read his letters. One more thing about those 10 years, because it explains the man in the white robes. Orenthal performed the 8th form in public for the last time at 59. Not badly. He simply could not complete the rotation, and he covered it, and nobody watching noticed. He knew. He spent the following 12 years never performing it again and never explaining why, and inventing a knee injury that eventually became real from favoring it. And every single year of that, he had access to the original manuscript. It was 11 galleries down from his own office. He could have walked in and read it any afternoon he liked. He never did, not once in 12 years, which is the most human thing in this entire account and the most damning. And in the last of those 10 years, Varric Kest did something that nobody found out about until long afterwards. He went to Aldermoor, once, unannounced without a clerk, and stayed 4 hours and asked 11 people a series of extremely precise questions about what they had been answering for 60 years. And then he went back to the capital and wrote nothing down, and never mentioned it, and voted 9 months later to burn 11,000 books. Yenna Cardew remembered him. She said he was the only visitor in 63 years who thanked them. So that is the decade. A dead surveyor who was right. 11 letters answered politely. A grandmaster who never walked down 11 galleries, and a bookkeeper who said thank you and then voted for the fire. Nobody in it is a monster. Every one of them is doing a reasonable thing, carefully, inside a structure that made the reasonable thing lethal. And a courier climbed a mountain 11 miles once a month for 11 years, and pushed bread through a slot, and said 4 minutes worth of true things to the only person in the empire who could fix any of it. So now we're back at the beginning. 200 people, a door coming open for the first time in a decade, and a boy on his hands and knees who squints at the sun like he's never seen it. Now you know what that sentence actually was. That was not a madman babbling. That was a 995-year-old scholar in the body of a 19-year-old, who had spent 9 centuries reading every book Orenthal's authority was built on, and who had opened with the single most surgical sentence available to him, because he'd had 11 years at the door to choose it. He picked the 8th form for 3 reasons. It was the Grandmaster's signature technique. It was the one he'd stopped performing in public 11 years ago, quietly blaming his knee. And the flaw in it, that dropped exhale, was recorded nowhere except in the original manuscript, which was in the Undercroft, which nobody had been inside in 10 years, except the man saying it. So when Orenthal went white, every person in that courtyard read it as the shock of an insult. Corin read it correctly. He read it as a man discovering that the errand he set a decade ago had come back finished. "Take him to the infirmary," said the Grandmaster. His voice was steady, give him that. "He's raving, 10 years alone. Get him warm, get him fed, and get him somewhere quiet." And that would have been the end of it. Quiet room, quiet accident. A boy who didn't survive his release, which surprises nobody. Except that a woman in the black of a 4th seat master stepped out of the crowd and said, loudly enough to carry, "I'll take him." 26 years old. Lowborn, the most talked about martial talent in 3 generations, and roughly 9 ranks too junior to be interrupting the Grandmaster in a public courtyard. Cellar Wren walked past 2 guards, got a shoulder under Corin's arm, took his weight, and it was nothing. He weighed nothing, and looked up at Orenthal on the steps. "With respect, Grandmaster, the infirmary's full. Half the East Wing has the coughing sickness. Beat, I have room." And there was a silence in that courtyard about 4 seconds long, in which a great many people worked out a great many things at once. Then Thal said pleasantly, "Of course, Master Wren," and turned away and went inside, which is what you do when you have just realized, in public, that the errand and the prodigy are connected, and that you have perhaps 20 minutes to decide what kind of man you're going to be about it. She got him down the mountain in a cart. She didn't speak for the first hour, neither did he. He was busy, genuinely, completely busy, with the sky. 995 years of stone ceiling. He lay in the back of a cart on his spine and looked up at open air and could not make his eyes deal with it. Distance had stopped being a thing he had a sense of. Clouds moved and it made him nauseous. Wind on skin was so overwhelming he had to put his hands over his face. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, he said, muffled through his fingers, "It's very loud. It's a cart. It's the loudest thing that has ever happened." And Cellar Wren, 26, master of the 4th seat, laughed for the first time in about 4 years, and then made a noise that wasn't a laugh and had to stop the cart for a minute. Because here's the thing she'd been carrying since she was 16. For her, this was a man she'd been talking to through a door for a decade. 120 conversations, 4 minutes each. 8 hours total across 10 years. Less time than she'd spent with most colleagues in a month. For him, it had been 995 years, and she was the only human voice in all of it. She knew the ratio. He told her at delivery 9. She'd done the arithmetic on the walk down and been quietly sick behind a rock. "I thought you'd be old," she said eventually. "I am extremely old. You look 19. Yes, that's going to be a problem for both of us. Let's talk about the empire he came out into, because 10 years had not been kind to it. The thinning had accelerated, not because it got worse. It didn't. A system running at 40% for 3 centuries eventually runs out of margin, and the margin went while he was inside. The Kessin mine flooded in the 7th year and killed 110 men, because the technique for reading water pressure through rock had been taught wrong for 2 generations, and the Order's surveyor swore the seam was dry. The coughing sickness, his parents' sickness, came back in the 8th year and did not stop. Vellum physicians charged 40 silver a visit for a draft that no longer worked, and then charged again. And when people started dying in numbers, the Order's official position was that the strain had changed. The strain had not changed. The draft had. 3 bridges came down. A harbor wall gave way at Corin and took a fishing fleet with it. And in every case, the Order sent an investigator. and the investigator found operator error, and the Empire looked at its own people and concluded again that everyone had simply gotten lazy. Corin got all of this from Sella in a farmhouse over 4 days, sitting up in a chair he couldn't get out of unassisted, listening to a decade of news. He didn't say much. He asked for the details of the Kessin flood twice, which she found odd until she understood what he was doing. He was reciting the corrected pressure reading technique to himself, and working out precisely how many of those 110 men would have lived if he'd been 11 years faster. The answer was 110. He got very quiet after that. Now, the body. This is the part that makes the whole story work, so let's not skip it. Corin Vale came out of that mountain holding every martial art the Empire had ever recorded. Corrected. Restored. In 400 cases improved beyond anything the original masters achieved. He also could not climb a flight of stairs. 995 years in a chair. Preserved, not maintained. The muscle mass of a long illness, the bone density of a much older man. And a nervous system that had spent a millennium doing nothing more strenuous than turning pages. On the 5th day he tried the standing water form, his own form, the first thing he ever corrected. He got 4 breaths in, and something in his lower back went with a sound Sella heard from the next room. She found him on the floor, furious, laughing, crying slightly, unable to move his legs. "I know 900 forms," he said to the ceiling. "I know the true version of every single one of them. I am the most knowledgeable martial artist who has ever lived. Yes, I am also a wet paper bag. Sella I need you to hit me." She stared at him. "What?" "Not now, in about a year, when I can stand." He was still looking at the ceiling. "You're the only person alive who can perform any of this properly. You're going to have to be my hands until I've got my own back. And then you're going to have to hit me repeatedly for a long time. Because I have 900 years of theory and 0 years of anybody actually trying to hurt me. And theory is going to get me killed." Sella Ren sat down on the floor next to him. "You want me to train you? You've been my student for 10 years, turnabout." "Corin," she wasn't laughing now. "Do you know what happens if the Order finds out what you are?" "I've got a fairly detailed idea, yes." "No, she stopped, started again. "You've got a literary idea, you've read about it, I've watched it." Master Pharaoh corrected 1 stance in a courtyard, and she was gone in 9 days. Nobody said she was killed. Nobody said anything. She was reassigned to a border post that doesn't exist, and there's a file on her with a stamp on it, and I have seen the stamp. Eileen Pharaoh is alive. I didn't say that. You said there's a file with a stamp. If she were dead, there'd be a death record. The Order is fanatical about records. It's the entire... He stopped. His eyes had gone unfocused. In the way Sella had learned, through a door meant he was reading something from 4 centuries back. "Corin, there's a place," he said slowly. "It's in the 7th gallery, a logistics ledger from the Order's founding. Supply runs to holdings that aren't on any map. I read it twice in year 311, and I thought it was an accounting error. Because one of them has been receiving food deliveries continuously for 400 years, and it isn't on any charter." He looked at her. "They don't kill people who correct the books," he said. "They store them." And that was the moment this stopped being a story about revenge and started being a rescue. The next 14 months are the part of this story nobody would put in a manhwa, and they are the reason the rest of it lands. He learned to walk again, not metaphorically, literally. Sella measured out 100 paces in a farmyard, and he did them. And then he did them again, and on the 9th day he did them without stopping, and was so pleased with himself that he tried a 10th and had to be carried inside. He wrote his own program from a rehabilitation text he'd corrected in year 806. A text the Order had let lapse entirely, because it was written for people recovering from famine, and there is no money in poor people getting better. It was brutal. It was also correct, in a way nothing else in the Empire was, and that showed. Month 4, he could hold a stance for a minute. Month 7, he could hold it for 10, and the farmhouse well went still and rang when he breathed. Month 9, Sella hit him for the first time, and he went through a fence. Month 11, she hit him, and he wasn't there. She stood in a farmyard with her fist in the space where a man had been, and felt the hair go up on her arms. Because she knew every technique he'd used to not be there, she'd learned them from him, through a door, one at a time. And she had never once considered chaining 3 of them into a single movement. Because no manual anywhere suggests it. Because no manual anywhere was written by somebody who'd read all of them. "You're compressing," she said. "The 9th evasion and the sparrow turn, and what's the 3rd? It doesn't have a name. It's on page 11 of a book about unloading cargo ships. There's a way stevedores shift weight to get out from under a falling crate. Nobody's ever written it as a martial technique, because nobody who writes martial techniques has ever worked a dock. Sella stared at him. You put dock work in a combat form. I put dock work, 2 physicians' texts on joint loading, and a passage about how horses turn. That's the thing nobody understands about the archive, Sella. It isn't 60,000 books. It's 60,000 books that have never once been read by the same person. That's the real cheat, by the way, not the correcting, the cross-referencing. Every master in the Empire has read 40 books deeply in one discipline. Corin Vale has read all 60,000 twice. And he is the only mind in history in which a swordsman's footwork and a dockhand's shoulder and a horse's turning circle have ever been in the same room. Meanwhile, they started giving the cure away, quietly, through an apothecary in a town called Ellick, a nervous woman named Pell, who Sella had known since childhood, who was handed a sheet of paper with the corrected fever draft on it, and told to make it exactly, and to charge nothing, and to never say where it came from. Pell read it and said, "This isn't the draft. No, this has silverleaf in it. Silverleaf's a weed, it grows in the ditch." "Yes. The vellum draft costs 40 silver and it doesn't have." She stopped, looked at the page again, looked up. "It's the ditch weed, isn't it? That's the ingredient they took out." "That's the one they took out," said Corin. "You can't sell a monopoly on something that grows in a ditch." 11 days later, the coughing sickness stopped in Ellick. Not slowed, stopped. 81 people who were going to die that winter did not die that winter. And the news went out of that valley the way news does, which is fast, sideways, and completely uncontrollably. By spring, there were 19 towns making it. By summer, there were 200. And in the Vellum Order's revenue ledger, one entire column simply fell over. Now, that's the moment the order stopped being an institution and started being an animal, so it's worth being precise about how they responded. They did not investigate the cure. Read that again. There was a plague their medicine could not touch, and somebody had solved it, and the Vellum Order did not send a single physician to find out how. They sent auditors, because from the inside this was not a medical event, it was an intellectual property event. Somebody was distributing an unlicensed method, and the correct response to an unlicensed method is to find the source and stop it. And if 100,000 people happen to get better in the meantime, that is a regrettable side effect of a crime. The auditor assigned to Ellick was a man named Corvin Ash, and he arrived with 11 enforcers and a writ, and he was, in fairness, extremely good at his job. He worked out in 4 days that the paper had come through Pell. He worked out in 6 that Pell had a childhood friend in the order. And on the 7th day, at dusk, he walked into a farmyard 2 valleys over with 11 armed men, and found a 26-year-old master of the 4th seat and a thin young man sitting on a fence. "Master Wren, you're a long way from your post. I'm on leave. You're on leave in a farmhouse with a convict." "He's not a convict. He served his sentence. That's rather the definition." Ash smiled and looked at Corin and said the thing that people kept saying and would keep saying right up until it killed them. "He doesn't look like much. Here's what 995 years of theory and 11 months of physical training will actually buy you against 11 professional soldiers. Almost nothing. That's important. The Order's enforcers were not fools with sticks. They were fit, drilled, armored men who had trained together for years, using techniques that were 40% broken, but using them correctly together at speed, which is worth a great deal more than most stories admit. Corin dropped 3 of them in about 4 seconds, and it was the most beautiful thing Sella had ever seen. He came off the fence into the first man's knee, at an angle no martial text in the Empire describes, because it's from a veterinary manual about how to safely bring down a horse. He took the second one's elbow with a joint lock out of a 400-year-old text on setting fractures, run backwards. The third he simply wasn't in front of anymore, and then was behind, and then that man was asleep. Then the 4th one hit him with a club and broke his forearm, and the 5th put him on the ground, and that was that. Because the theory was perfect, and the body was 11 months old. Sella Wren took the remaining 7. It took her 19 seconds, and she did not need any of them to be asleep afterwards. And when she was done, she was standing over Corvin Ash with her hand open, and a technique loaded that he could not have described, let alone defended, because it was the 5th binding as written in the year 440, and the version in his head had 11 lines missing. "You can't do that," Ash said. He was on his back and there was blood in his mouth and he genuinely sounded offended. That's not, the fifth binding doesn't work like that. No, Seller agreed. It doesn't, not the way they taught you. And there it was, said out loud in a farmyard to an officer of the order. The secret was out of the mountain. They let Ash go. That was Corin's call, made lying on his back with a broken arm, and Sella hated it and did it anyway. He'll report all of it. Yes, he'll report me. He'll report that a fourth-seat master performed a technique that doesn't exist, and that a released convict fought like nothing anyone's seen. Corin was staring at the sky. He did that a lot that first year. And do you know what the order will do with that report, Sella? They'll bury it. Because the only two explanations are that their manuals are wrong, or that we're both frauds, and one of those costs them an empire. So they bury it and send more men. They'll send more men, yes. He tried to sit up, failed, accepted help. Which is why we're not going to be here. We're going to a holding that isn't on any map to collect a 54-year-old woman who has been in a box for 11 years for cracking a courtyard. He got his feet under him. And then, said Corin Vale, I'm going to go and have a conversation with the man who signed my trial. What he didn't say, what he wouldn't say for another 2 months, was that there had been 2 signatures on that page. He'd told Sella about Thal. He had not told her about Hallow. 995 years, and he still couldn't say it out loud, which tells you something about what that old man had been to him. The first thing he did, once he could stand for more than a minute, was cut his hair. 995 years of it, on the floor of a farmhouse in about 4 minutes. And what was underneath, it was a 19-year-old. Sella came in with firewood and stopped in the doorway and did not say anything for about 6 seconds, which he enjoyed enormously. Aldermoor was 3 days east, past the last village anyone had bothered to name. And from the ridge it looked like a monastery. Walls, a courtyard, outbuildings, a kitchen garden that somebody clearly loved. 11 people working in the open, no guards on the wall. That's not a prison, said Sella. No, Corin agreed. He was looking at the garden. It's a farm. They walked in through an unlocked gate, and nobody stopped them. And the first person they met was a woman of about 80 carrying a basket of onions, who looked at Corin's face and dropped the basket. Oh, she said, they finally sent one out. Here's what Aldermoor was. Every so often, once a generation, sometimes less, somebody in the Vellum Order notices. A scribe compares 2 copies. A master finds a stance that works better wrong. A physician realizes the draft used to have something in it. The order does not kill them. Killing a person who notices is enormously wasteful, because a person who notices is the rarest resource the order has. The order collects them, 11 people at Aldermoor. The oldest had been there 63 years. They had beds, food, books, actual books brought in by cart, and paper and ink, and absolutely no way out and no contact with anyone. And once a season, a clerk came from the capital with a list of questions. Why does the iron root stance fail on stone? What is missing from the fever draft? The 4th seat cannot complete the 8th form. Advise. And the 11 people of Aldermoor, who had nothing else in the world to do and nothing else to be proud of, would work on the questions and answer them. And the clerk would take the answers back to the capital, where the inner circle of the Vellum Order would use them, quietly, to keep functioning. That's it, that's the whole machine. The Order had not lost the keystones. The Order had been outsourcing them for 4 centuries to a shed full of prisoners it fed and never freed, while telling the Empire that the arts were failing because students were lazy. They send us the questions, said the old woman. Her name was Yenakardu and she had been a physician once. And we answer them, and if you answer well, you get better paper. Sella had gone completely still. You helped them. For 63 years, Yena picked up an onion unbothered. What would you have done, girl? Refuse. Then you sit in a room with nothing. At least this way the answer exists somewhere. At least this way when they ask about the coughing sickness, someone writes down the true draft, even if they only ever use it on nobles. She looked at Corin, at the face on the 1,000-year-old man. And every one of us has spent every year in here hoping that one day somebody would ask a question we couldn't answer. Because that would mean there was finally someone out there better at this than we are. They stopped sending questions 11 years ago, she said. All at once, never explained. Corin worked it out in about a second and a half. And it was the first time in the entire story that he looked genuinely frightened. 11 years ago, the Order had stopped needing Aldermoor. Because 11 years ago, they had sealed something better into a mountain. Eileen Farrow was in the East Wing, and she was 54 years old, and she had not cracked a courtyard in 11 years. She had a room, a window, a desk, and 400 sheets of paper covered in a stance she had performed exactly once. She looked up when Corin came in, and it took her a long moment. "You're the page," she said. "The cart boy, Master Pharaoh, you haven't aged." "I have extensively, it doesn't show." He sat down because standing still tired him. "I need to ask you something, and you're not going to like it. When you performed the iron root stance as it was originally written, what happened to your leg?" The room went very quiet. She pushed back from the desk and pulled up the hem of her robe. And there was nothing wrong with her leg at all, until she moved it and the whole limb came up in a way a leg is not supposed to come up. Loose in the hip. Wrong. "Shattered the joint," she said. 9 places in 3 seconds. The stone cracked because the force went out through the floor. And it went out through the floor because it had already gone through me. Everyone in that courtyard saw a wall come down. Nobody saw me not be able to stand up afterwards. I've been on this side of a wall for 11 years, and I have spent every day of it trying to work out how a technique that is correct nearly killed the person who used it. Corin closed his eyes. "Because they weren't cutting the manuals to keep power," he said. "Not originally. No, they were cutting them because the full versions are lethal. This is the twist that reframes the whole story, so let's give it room. 312 years ago, there was a city called Varen, 40,000 people. It's not on maps anymore, and there's no ruin, which should tell you enough. A master of the Vellum Order, using the arts as they were originally written, at full, correct, uncut strength, did something at Varen that the surviving records describe only as the event. What we know is the crater and the number, and the Order's response in the year after was to go into the Undercroft and quietly perform surgery on 60,000 books. They didn't destroy anything. That's the part that damns them and the part that saved everything. They were scholars, and even in a panic they could not bring themselves to burn a page. They redacted, they took the keystones out of the copies. The originals stayed in the mountain, intact, complete, and lethal. The idea was to make the art survivable. Weaker, yes. 40%, yes. But survivable and teachable and safe in the hands of an 18-year-old with more ambition than sense. For about 60 years, that was arguably a defensible decision made by frightened people. Then the generation that made it died. And the generation after inherited a system in which the Order owned the only complete copies of everything, and everyone else had the safe version, and discovered that this was extraordinarily profitable, and stopped asking why it existed. By Orenthal's time, nobody in the inner circle remembered Varen at all. They just knew that the manuals had to stay cut, and that anyone who noticed had to go to Aldermoor, and that the whole beautiful machine had to keep turning. They were guarding a reason they had forgotten. "So the Order is right," said Sella. She sounded ill. "The full techniques are too dangerous." "The Order is right about the danger and wrong about the answer," said Corin. He was looking at Pharaoh's 400 sheets of paper. They only had 2 options: full strength, which kills the user, or cut, which makes everyone weak and them rich. And they picked the one that made them rich and called it safety. He picked up a sheet. Pharaoh looked up sharply. "But there was always a third option. It just requires somebody to have read all 60,000 books." "Meaning what?" "Meaning your iron root stance destroyed your hip, because the original assumes you're standing on packed earth and dissipating force downward through soil." He turned the page around. "You were on flagstone over bedrock. There's nowhere for it to go, so it came back up the leg. The technique isn't lethal, Master Pharaoh. It's unfinished. Whoever wrote it never had to use it indoors." He set the page down. "I can finish it." He worked for 9 days in a room at Aldermoor with 11 of the best minds the Empire had ever thrown away. And at the end of it, Eileen Pharaoh stood in a courtyard on flagstone over bedrock and performed the iron root stance at full strength. The yard did not crack. The air cracked about 30 feet out, and a stack of firewood came apart. And Pharaoh was standing there afterwards with both hips intact, breathing hard, looking at her own hands. Full power, no cost. Because a man who had read a book about soil mechanics in year 406 had put one line into a martial text that no martial artist would ever have thought to look for. That's the ability, finally completely on display. Not he is strong, not he knows more. He is the only person alive who can make the true version safe. And that means the Vellum Order's entire justification. The one thing that made 3 centuries of theft defensible even to themselves, evaporated in a courtyard in front of 11 prisoners. They were not protecting the world from the arts. They were protecting the world from a problem that had been solvable the entire time, if anyone had bothered to read the whole library. Yenna Cardew asked the obvious question that night over dinner with all 11 of them at the table. "How many can you do?" "All of them," said Corin. "Don't be flippant, boy. I'm not being flippant, I'm being precise." He put his spoon down. 60,000 volumes. Everyone twice. 995 years. There are 11,000 corrected volumes in the 19th gallery of the Undercroft in my handwriting. The table had gone extremely quiet. "There's a way out," said someone. There is. "I found it in year 43. I could have walked out at 19 with 200 books corrected and a lifetime ahead of me." "Why didn't you?" And Corin Vale, who was very old and looked like a boy, gave the only answer he had, which was the true one. "Because 200 wasn't all of them," he said. "The first thing that happened after a 54-year-old woman cracked the air instead of her own hip was that 11 prisoners stopped being prisoners, and nobody unlocked anything, because the gate had never been locked. Yenna Cardew was the first one through it at 80 years old, carrying nothing, and she got about 40 paces down the track and stopped and had to sit down on a stone. 63 years is a long time to imagine a door and then walk through it. She has said since that the worst part was that it was extremely ordinary. Pharaoh did not leave. That surprised everybody except Corin, who had expected it, because he had spent 9 days watching her look at 400 sheets of paper. She had spent 11 years working out why a correct technique nearly killed her, and she had got about 60% of the way there on her own, with no library and no second reading, which Corin found so impressive that he spent an entire afternoon telling her so, and she told him to stop, and he did not stop. So she stayed, and the holding stopped being a farm for people who notice and started being the first school in the empire that taught corrected technique. 11 students, all of them over 50, and every one of them had been told at some point in their lives that they were not good enough, which is the actual subject of this entire story if you take the mountain out of it. Corin went to a mine because he had spent 900 years reading about water and had never once seen any of it move. The Harrow Cut was 11 miles from Kessin, worked the same seam, and had the same survey signed by the same man. 240 men went down it every morning, and the Order's surveyor had declared it dry, and everybody in that valley had watched what happened at Kessin. So they had a strike on. 9 weeks by the time Corin got there. No pay, no coal, and a mine owner who could not understand why men would rather starve than work a seaman expert had cleared. Corin walked past all of that, put his splinted arm out of the way, and knelt down at the rock face with his good hand flat against the stone for about 4 minutes. This is the technique the Kessin surveyor used and got wrong. You read pressure through rock by feel and by sound, and the manual tells you where to put your hand and how long to wait. What the manual had lost, 2 generations back, was the line telling you to do it twice, once cold, and once after 9 minutes of your own body heat has gone into the stone. The difference between the two is the whole reading. 1 reading tells you there is water somewhere. 2 readings tell you how far away it is. He knelt there for 19 minutes. Then he stood up and told a mine owner, 2 foremen and 140 striking miners that the seam was wet at about 60 feet, and that they had between 4 and 9 days. The mine owner asked who he was. And this is where it gets interesting, because the honest answer was nobody. He had no rank, no seal, no charter, and no name anybody would recognize. He was a thin young man with a broken arm and an opinion, standing in front of the only expert opinion that legally counted. And what actually saved those men was not the technique, and it was not Corin. It was that 140 miners had already refused to go down for 9 weeks on nothing but a bad feeling. He did not convince them of anything. He told them in language they could check why they had been right. And then he did the thing that made it stick, which was that he wrote the corrected technique out on 3 sheets of paper and gave it to the foreman and did not ask for anything. Do it yourselves next time. It's 2 readings 9 minutes apart. Any of you can do it, that's the whole thing. The Harrow Cut flooded on the 6th day. Nobody was in it, and 140 men stood in the rain and looked at a hole full of water that they had all been ordered into 9 weeks earlier, and worked out for themselves what that meant. That is the moment the Vellum Order lost the countryside. Not the plague, not the trial. A wet hole in the ground in a valley nobody important has ever visited. The plague towns were harder, and they were harder for a reason that Corin did not expect and took badly. The corrected draft works. It worked in Elik, and it worked in 19 towns, and it worked in 200. But it works on people who are still alive. Yenna Cardew, 80 years old, 6 days out of a holding she had been in for 63 years, walked into a town called Werrick with a corrected formula and found 400 people past the point where any formula helps. She worked for 11 days. She saved about 260. She has never once described that as a success and gets extremely short with anybody who does. Corin was there for the last 4 days of it. He is, remember, the most knowledgeable physician who has ever lived, and he had never treated a patient in his life. Yenna put him on water and buckets for 2 days before she let him near anybody. And when he objected, she said that knowing what a fever is and sitting with one are different trades. She was right, and he knew she was right. And it is the only time in the entire story that somebody outranks him on knowledge, and he simply accepts it. On the 3rd night, a woman asked him whether her son was going to live. And Corin, who could have told her the exact figure because he had read every study, said he didn't know. Which was a lie. He knew. It was about 1 in 9. Yenna told him afterwards that it was the first properly medical thing he had done all week. The boy lived. That is not a payoff, and the story does not treat it as one. 411 people in that town did not. And this is where Corin's revenge quietly stops being about a trial. Because the arithmetic is not complicated. The draft was cut around 300 years ago. The sickness runs about every 11 years. Nobody has counted properly, and nobody ever will. But it is not 4,000 people. It is 4,000 people in the last decade alone in one province, and there are 11 provinces, and it has been 300 years. He does not say the total out loud at any point in this story. He worked it out on a road between 2 towns and then did not speak for the rest of the day. They moved 11 times in 4 months. Not hiding, exactly. The orders writs were being served in one town while they were treating in the next, and the auditors were always about 9 days behind. And in every town they left, the corrected sheets stayed. That is the entire strategy, and Corin did not think of it as one. He simply could not bring himself to leave a working method in a place, and then take it away again, which is the least strategic instinct a person can have, and turned out to be unanswerable. By the 5th month, the order was not chasing a man. It was chasing about 900 pieces of paper, in 19 dialects, being copied by people who could not be prosecuted because copying is not a crime. Varric Kest wrote a memorandum in that month that is worth quoting, because it is the moment the order understood what had happened to it. He wrote, "The method is no longer recoverable. Recommend we stop attempting recovery and begin attempting attribution." Which means, we cannot get the knowledge back, so let's make sure everyone believes it came from us. It is, genuinely, the correct institutional response. It is also the moment the Vellum Order became a brand rather than an authority, and everybody in that council chamber knew it. And in the 6th month, on a road outside a town called Faro, 4 order enforcers stopped a cart, and one of them was extremely large and had a scar along his jaw. Bram Kell had been dismissed from the initiates in the spring of the year Corin was sealed. No family, no rank, and one marketable quality, which is that he was enormous. So he took the only job an order reject can get, and had been doing it for 11 years, competently and without enthusiasm. He looked at the thin young man on the cart bench for about 4 seconds. And then he looked at the road and stepped aside and told his 3 men that the cart was a supply run and they were wasting the afternoon. Neither of them said a word. Corin has been asked since whether Bram recognized him, and he says he has no idea and that it is possible the man simply did not want the paperwork. We know the answer, because 11 months later Bram Kell puts a crate down on a gallery floor and says 2 words. But Corin does not know it yet, and he spends the following year assuming he got lucky. They came back to Aldermoor in the winter, and it had 11 students and a name it had given itself, and Pharaoh had cracked a second courtyard deliberately to see if she could stop. She could, that is the entire point of the corrected version, and she needed to prove it to herself about 9 times before she believed it. And there, in a frozen courtyard, with 11 ex-prisoners over 50 and a woman who could walk again, Corin Vale finally said out loud what he had been avoiding for 4 months. He told Sella about the second signature. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked him what he was going to do about it, and he said he was going to go and ask, which she said was not an answer, and he agreed. Because it wasn't. He had had 4 months and 995 years, and he genuinely did not know what he wanted from Denhall Hallow. An apology would have been worthless. An explanation he could already construct himself. And revenge on a 71-year-old archivist is not a thing a person can want out loud. What he settled on the road east, was a single question. And it is not the one anybody expects, and it is the one that ends up defining him. Archivist Denhall Hallow was 71 years old, and he was exactly where Corin knew he'd be. The ninth gallery, on a stool, with a pot of ink and a broken spine, reshelving. He'd been head archivist for 9 years. He still reshelved. Some things about a person don't change. He didn't turn round when the footsteps came. "You took your time," he said. "I had 60,000 books to finish." "Yes," Hallow set a volume on the shelf, spine out, aligned. "I rather thought you would." And that one sentence, delivered with the mild satisfaction of a man whose plan has come in on schedule, is the moment Corin Vale understood he had never once been the smartest person in this story. "You forged the annotations." "I did." "You spent 11 weeks copying my notes into originals in my handwriting. You defaced the archive, Hallow, 41 volumes. You did the thing they sealed me for." "Yes." "Why?" And the old man finally turned round, and he looked awful. Not guilty. Awful in the way of somebody who has been holding something up alone for a very long time. "Because you were the fourth one I found," he said, "and you were the only one who was young enough." Here's what Denhall Hallow had known, and for how long. 40 years since he was a scribe with too much curiosity and access to the 7th gallery. He'd found the logistics ledger, the same one Corin found in year 311, and traced the food deliveries to Aldermoor. 31 years since he'd found the Varen records and understood why. 26 years since he'd worked out that the machine could not be fixed from inside. He'd tried. He'd written papers. He'd been promoted. Twice. Which is what an institution does to a man who is becoming a problem. And 19 years since he had found, in a builder's survey in the 7th gallery, a footnote about the Undercroft's construction, about what the vault does to time, about the fact that whatever the mountain was built for originally, its makers had needed something inside it to have a very long while to work. 1,000 years, said Hallow. 1 month out here, 8 years in there. I checked it 11 ways. And I sat with that number for 6 years, Corin, because 1,000 years is not a sentence you can give a person. It's not even a thing a person can be. So you gave it to me. I gave it to the only mind I ever met that could use it. The old man's voice didn't rise. You were 19. You'd found the thinning on your own in 11 weeks with a cart and a candle, which is 11 weeks faster than I managed it with 40 years and a title. If I let you keep talking, they'd have put you in Aldermoor by the spring, and you'd have spent 60 years answering clerks' questions on good paper. Aldermoor gets you 100 corrected techniques and a wasted life. The Undercroft got the Empire its library back. I made that trade. I have not slept properly since, and I would make it again this afternoon. Sella hit him. Not hard. She is a 4th seat master and Hallow is 71, and if she'd wanted him dead, he'd have been dead. She hit him once and he went off the stool and sat down among the books. He was 19, she said. He was 19 and you were the only person he had. I know exactly what I was to him. Then how? Because there were 110 men in the Kessin mine, said Hallow from the floor, and 4,000 dead of the coughing sickness in the last decade alone. And there will be more of both every single year forever, unless somebody does something impossible. I found somebody who could do the impossible thing, and then I made him do it. If you're waiting for me to tell you I feel clean about it, girl, I'm going to be here a while. Corin hadn't moved. Thal signed it, he said. Thal signed it because I made him. With what? With the 8th form. Hallow got himself back onto the stool, slowly. Oren Thal has not been able to perform his own signature technique since he was 59. He knows the manual is wrong. He has known for years he's not a stupid man, he's a frightened one. He has spent 40 years as the most powerful person in the Empire, terrified that someone will ask him to demonstrate. And you told him you'd ask. I told him I'd ask in public, a grim little shrug. And then I put a paper in front of him about a page who'd been making notes, and he signed it so fast he tore the sheet. Corin was very still. That's why he went white in the courtyard. Of course it is, you opened with the 8th form. For a second, something almost fond crossed the old man's face. I taught you to shelve, boy. You've learned to aim. There is no version of this where Corin forgives him. But he also doesn't kill him, and the reason is the most Corin thing in the entire story. He crouched down in front of the stool so they were level, and he asked one question. Did you know I'd find the way out? The eastern shaft. 17th gallery, 14 inches, 110 feet. It's in the same builder's survey you read, the one with the footnote about time. He waited. You read that survey, you knew about the shaft. Hallow's hands had gone still on the book in his lap. Yes. You put me in a room with a door in it and you didn't tell me. Yes. Why? And the old man looked at him. 19 years old, 995 years old, sitting on the floor of a library where he had once pushed a cart, and gave him the only compliment he ever paid him. Because if I'd told you it was there, you'd have been a man deciding whether to stay, he said. I needed you to be a man who found it and stayed anyway. That's a different person, Corin, and I needed the different person. Corin stood up. You were right, he said, and walked away and did not speak to Denhall Hallow again for 4 years, which the old man understood perfectly and accepted without complaint, because he had budgeted for considerably worse. Grandmaster Orenthal was in the high hall, and he was not hiding, and he had dismissed his guards, which was, Corin thought, the first genuinely impressive thing the man had done. You know what I am, said Corin. I know you were in that mountain for a length of time I cannot make myself think about, and I know you came out of it with the archive in your head. Thal was standing at a window with his back to the room. I have known since you said the word exhale. You could have had me killed in the courtyard. I could have had you killed at 19. Thal turned round. Do you imagine I signed that paper cheerfully? A page. A child. Hallow put it in front of me and told me what it would cost to refuse, and I signed it. And I have known every day since that I put a boy in a hole to protect my own reputation. He said it flatly, no self-pity. That was worse. So here we are, said Thal. You have the corrected archive, you intend to publish it. Yes, then let me tell you what you'll cause. There are 40,000 people under the ground at Varen. Not buried, under, there was no burying. I know, I've read the record, twice. Then you know the arts at full strength kill the people who use them and everyone standing nearby. And you propose to hand that to every farmhand and gutter brawler in the Empire because you have a grievance about a library. Thal's voice finally rose. I am not defending the Order. The Order is a corpse that's forgotten it died. But the cut manuals are the only reason there has not been a second Varen. And if you undo 300 years of that in a week, boy, the number you'll kill will make Kessin look like a bad afternoon. And it is, genuinely, the best argument anyone makes in this entire story. Corin let it sit for a moment. Then Master Pharaoh performed the iron root stance at full strength 9 days ago, on flagstone over bedrock. Thal stopped. Her hip is intact, the firewood isn't. The technique was never lethal, Grandmaster, it was unfinished. It assumed soil. 300 years ago, your predecessors had a choice between a technique that killed its user and a technique that didn't work. And they never once considered that there might be a third version, because to find it you'd have to read a book about drainage. I'm not publishing the full versions, I'm publishing the finished ones. 60,000 volumes, corrected, completed, and safe. And the reason nobody has ever done that before is that it takes 1,000 years, and nobody has ever had 1,000 years. Silence in the high hall. You're lying, said Orenthal without conviction. You know I'm not, you've known since the courtyard. And then Corin Vale did the thing that ended the Vellum Order, and it wasn't a punch. He took a folded sheet out of his robe and held it out. That's the 8th form, he said, finished. There's an exhale on the rotation, and there's a note about your left knee, because the version you learned assumes a man of average height, and you're not. You've been compensating for 50 years, and it's why the knee hurts. Thal did not take it. Take it, said Corin. You'll be able to do it again. That's not a bribe and it's not a trap. It's just true and you can check it and you will. A long, long pause. The Grandmaster of the Vellum Order reached out and took a piece of paper from a boy who used to push a cart. Why, he said. Because I'm not here to beat you, said Corin. I'm here to fix a library, you're just standing in front of it. Orenthal spent the 4 months after that conversation trying to reform the Vellum Order from the inside, and it is worth watching him fail, because the way he fails is the whole reason the ending happens the way it does. He started, reasonably, by trying to check whether Corin was telling the truth, which nobody in that institution had done in 300 years. He sent 2 scribes into the 9th gallery with an old copy and a new copy of one text, and told them to compare it line by line, and to report to him personally. It took them an afternoon, 4 hours, to answer a question the Vellum Order had been avoiding for 3 centuries, and the answer was 9 lines and a diagram. Thal read the report, and then went and sat in the high hall on his own for most of a night, which is a thing 71-year-old men do when they have run out of ways to not know something. And in the morning he did the honorable thing, which turned out to be the fatal one. He called the council and told them the truth. Everything. Verin, the redaction Aldermoor, the boy sealed in a mountain for 1,000 subjective years, the 411 cuts, and the fact that the arts could be finished rather than kept broken. He expected relief. That is the thing that gets him. He genuinely expected 11 other people to be as relieved as he was that 300 years of an ugly secret had a solution. And Varric Kest waited until he had entirely finished, which is a courtesy, and then asked what the annual value of the order's licensing was. That is the whole argument. 9 words. He does not dispute a single fact. He does not defend the redaction. He asks an accounting question, and the accounting question wins. Because 11 people around that table had spent their entire adult lives inside an institution, and every one of them understood immediately that a free archive means no order at all. Not a reduced order, not a reformed one, nothing. A mountain, some shelves, and 11,000 people who no longer need to ask permission. Thal argued for 4 hours. He was not a stupid man, and he was not a coward, and he made every argument that could be made, and he lost every one of them to a single unanswerable point, which is that he was asking 11 people to vote themselves out of existence on the strength of a moral argument, and institutions do not do that. Not ever. Not once in recorded history. They did not vote that day. Kest was cleverer than that. He proposed a study and a working group and a schedule of consultations, and the council agreed with enormous relief. Because a study is how an institution says no without anybody having to say it. And while the Vellum Order was scheduling consultations, the countryside was doing something considerably faster. There were, by that winter, roughly 900 corrected sheets circulating in 19 dialects, and not one of them had a name on it. That was not modesty. Corin worked out very early that an unsigned method cannot be prosecuted, discredited, or bought, because there is nobody to prosecute, discredit, or buy. You cannot argue with a piece of paper that works. You can only produce a better one, and the Vellum Order could not, because the better one was the one they had cut. Provincial physicians started using the corrected draft openly in the spring. Not defiantly. Openly, in the way you use a thing that works, while continuing to pay their order license because nobody had told them to stop. Which is a wonderful detail because it means the order's income did not collapse dramatically. It leaked. 11%, then 19%, then a third, over 4 seasons, with nobody ever declaring anything. In the 5th month, Varric Kest requested a meeting with Corin Vale. In an inn, in a market town, alone with no writ and no enforcers. And this is the best scene in the whole middle of the story, because Kest is not a villain and he does not pretend to be one. He put a proposal on the table, a seat on the council, a stipend, full access to the Undercroft formally with a title, and the order publishes the corrected volumes over 20 years in a controlled sequence with attribution. Corin asked why 20 years. Kest said because that is how long it takes to retrain 11,000 practitioners without killing a large number of them, which is a real answer. It is, in fact, the correct answer, and Corin sat with it for a long moment, because a man who has just spent 4 days in a plagued town is not inclined to be cavalier about killing people. Then he asked one question. He asked what happens in year 3 of the 20 when the order works out that a controlled sequence is worth more than a completed one. And Varric Kest, to his enormous credit, did not lie. He said, then we would probably slow it down. Probably, certainly, said Kest. I would recommend it myself. It would be the responsible position. And that is the entire reason Corin says no. Not because Kest is corrupt. Because Kest is honest, and being honest he has just described exactly what an institution does with a monopoly forever, without needing anybody in it to be wicked. Kest folded the proposal, put it away, thanked him for his time, and left. He did not threaten him. There was no need. Both of them knew what was going to happen next. In the 7th month, the order finally dealt with Seller Wren, and they did it in the most bureaucratic way available. They did not expel her. She was the most capable martial artist the order had produced in 3 generations, and expelling her would have meant explaining why. So they promoted her. 3rd seat with responsibility for provincial instruction, based 400 miles away, effective immediately. It is a beautiful piece of administration. It is a genuine honor. It is impossible to refuse without insulting the council, and it puts her 19 days' ride from anything that matters. She refused it in writing in 4 lines, resigned her seat in the 5th, and was out of the building inside 2 hours with everything she owned in one bag. 11 years. 4 rejections at 16, a rank no lowborn had held in 90 years, and she put it down on a table and walked out into the rain. Her mother, who had scrubbed floors in the East Wing for 31 years, resigned the same afternoon, which nobody had asked her to do, and which Sella did not find out about for a week. By that winter, Aldermoor was not a holding. It was a school with 60 students, and about 40 of them had walked there. Eileen Farrow taught the corrected forms to anybody who arrived and asked, and charged nothing, and turned nobody away, and had a waiting list by spring that she refused to formalize. When somebody suggested ranks, she said the last institution that ranked people had put her in a box for 11 years, and that was the end of the discussion for as long as she lived. And in the 9th month, the thing the order had been most afraid of finally happened, and it did not come from Corin at all. A provincial magistrate in the eastern reaches refused to enforce an order licensing writ, not on principle, on evidence. He had 2 copies of the same manual in front of him, 400 years apart and 9 lines of difference, and he asked the order's advocate to explain the discrepancy, and the advocate could not. So he ruled that a license for an incomplete method could not be enforced as a license for a complete one, which is the driest sentence in this entire story, and it took down an empire. 19 magistrates followed him within 4 months, not because they were brave, because the first one had not been punished, and there is no faster way to lose an institution than to let the first refusal stand. Varric Kest saw all of it coming and wrote it down in advance in a memorandum that survives, and which is the single most damning document the Vellum Order ever produced. He wrote that the order had 2 assets, the archive and the belief that the archive was complete. He wrote that the second had already been lost and that the first was worth nothing without it. And he wrote, and this is the line that matters, that the only remaining question was whether the order ended in an orderly fashion or a disorderly one. He gave that memorandum to Oren Thal, who read it and understood it completely, and finally called the vote he had been avoiding for 11 months. Because Thal had decided, somewhere in that year, that if the order was going to end, he wanted it to end having done one honest thing first. He sent for Corin 4 days before the council. They met in the High Hall, and it is the second and last real conversation those 2 men ever have. Thal asked him what he intended to do if the vote went against him, and Corin said he intended to open the mountain anyway. Thal asked how. Corin said he had no idea, which was true, and that he had had 995 years of practice at doing a thing slowly until it was finished, which was also true. And Oren Thal laughed. Once, it is the only time anybody records him doing it. Then he told him about the 8th form, that he had performed it alone in this hall at 3 in the morning from a folded sheet of paper, and that it had worked, and that the knee had not hurt afterwards for the first time in 11 years, and that he had sat down on the floor of his own high hall and cried about it like an idiot. Corin said he was glad. He meant it. And the 2 of them stood in an enormous empty hall for a while not saying anything, which is as close to reconciliation as this story permits. Then Thal told him about the oil store on the 18th gallery. Not because he knew what Kest would do, because he knew what an institution does when it is cornered, and he wanted the boy to have the information. That single piece of information is the reason 4,000 people are standing on a mountain road 11 days later with lanterns. The council met on the 14th, 12 seats, 4 hours of argument, and then a vote that everybody in the room had known the shape of for 11 months. 9-3. Thal voted against. So did the 6th seat, an old woman who had trained under Oral Kish. So did one other, a man of 31 who had joined the council 4 months earlier and never explained himself. And Varric Kest, who had just won, stood up and gave 3 orders in a completely level voice. Close the mountain, double the guard, and send men to the 19th gallery to remove the unauthorized volumes. Thal walked out of that chamber, went down to a farmhouse 2 valleys away, and told a convict what his own council had voted for, which ended his career, his standing and his name, and which he did in about 4 hours without consulting anybody. It is the only unambiguously good thing Oren Thal does in this entire story, and he does it at 71, 11 years too late, having personally signed the paper that started all of it, which is, if you want it, the actual moral of the Vellum Order. Not that its people were evil, that they were ordinary and careful and reasonable, and that reasonable people signing sensible papers is how 40,000 people end up under a crater, and 4,000 more end up in a row on a hillside. And that it takes one page, one archivist, and 1,000 years to undo it. Orenthal called a full council of the Vellum Order 11 days later, and it went catastrophically badly, and in fairness he should have seen it coming. He stood in front of the 12 seats and told them the truth, all of it. Varen, the redaction, Aldermoor, the boy in the mountain. And the fact that the arts could be finished rather than cut. He expected relief. 300 years of an ugly secret solved. What he got was second seat Varric Kest, aged 44, extremely intelligent, and the man who actually ran the order's revenue, asking one quiet question. Grandmaster, what is the annual value of our licensing? Roughly 9 million silver. And if the corrected texts are free to copy, what is it? Silence, nothing, said Kest. It's nothing, there is no Vellum Order. There is a mountain full of paper that anybody may walk into. He looked around the table at 11 other people, whose entire lives were built on that number. I have no objection to the truth, said Varric Kest. I object to bankruptcy. Those are different things, and I would ask the council not to confuse them. The vote was 9-3. Thal was Grandmaster, and Grandmaster is a title, and titles are worth exactly what the people around the table decide they are worth. They didn't depose him. They simply voted, politely, unanimously enough to secure the Undercroft. Secure is a wonderful word. It can mean almost anything. Kest left the chamber and gave 3 orders. Close the mountain, double the guard, and send men to the 19th gallery to remove the unauthorized volumes. 11,000 books in one man's handwriting. 1,000 years of work. And a lamp oil store on the 18th gallery, because the cold lamps had never needed it and nobody had bothered to move it out in 6 centuries. Corin found out because Orenthal told him. That's worth saying plainly. The Grandmaster of the Vellum Order walked out of his own council, went down to a farmhouse, and told a convict what his own council had voted for. 6, said Corin, maybe 8, they'll want it done overnight. They'll want it done quietly. Same thing. Sella, how many people can you get to that mountain by dawn? Order people? None. I'm a 4th seat the council just voted. Anyone who helps me is finished. Not order people. There are 19 villages in that valley, said Corin, and they've all got the draft. Sella Wren rode into Ellick at sunset and stood on a cart in the square and said, they're going to burn the place the paper came from. She did not have to say it twice. They came up the mountain road all night. Not an army. Let's be accurate, this was not an army. This was farmers, and a blacksmith, and 2 midwives, and a great many people in their 50s, carrying lanterns and hay forks, and in one memorable case, a rolling pin. Nobody there could have stood against a single trained enforcer. There were, by the time the sky went gray, somewhere close to 4,000 of them. And that is a different problem entirely, because a squad of enforcers cannot set fire to a national archive in front of 4,000 witnesses who have all worked out exactly what is inside it. Varric Kest, who was not a coward and was very far from stupid, stood at the iron door at dawn and understood that he had been beaten by logistics. Then he did the thing that made him dangerous. He had the door shut from the inside, with 40 enforcers and the lamp oil and himself sealed in. 4,000 people outside a mountain, and the mountain didn't care. He'll do it, said Pharaoh. He'll burn the 19th gallery and walk out and tell them there was an accident, and in 30 years it'll be in a book. That oil stores under the 18th. If it goes up in that stairwell, it'll take 4 galleries before anyone can get near it. He's not removing my volumes. He's going to lose the originals. Then we go through the door. We can't. It took 6 men to move, and there are 40 on the other side. Then what? And Corin Vale, 995 years old, started to laugh. 14 inches, he said. The eastern shaft. 110 feet of vertical rock, 14 inches at the narrowest, coming out on a scree slope on the far face. A way out he'd found in year 43 and never taken. He'd never taken it out. Nobody had ever considered it as a way in. Because to get in you'd need to descend 110 feet in the dark, and then compress your ribcage through a 14-inch throat. And there was exactly one living person who knew the technique for that. You can't, said Sella. Your arm still. Yes, you'll break something, almost certainly, Corin. He turned round. Sella, I spent 952 years in there after I found the way out. He was very calm. You don't get to be surprised that I'm going back in. He went down the shaft at first light. It took him 2 hours and 11 minutes, and it broke 2 ribs and reopened the forearm. And at the narrowest point, He was stuck for 11 minutes with his own shoulder blade locked against stone and one arm pinned above his head. And he got through it by doing the thing that had kept him alive for a millennium, which was to think about a book. He came out on the 17th gallery at 8:30 in the morning, bleeding, in a library he knew better than his own hands, with 40 enforcers somewhere above him and a lamp oil store on the level below. He was too weak to fight 40 men. He was, however, standing inside 60,000 books, and the reason that mattered has nothing to do with martial arts. Varric Kest's men had been in the 19th gallery for 3 hours, and they had moved perhaps 400 volumes. 11,000 books is a lot of books. They'd expected a shelf. They'd found a room and then another room and then a gallery. And somewhere an hour too, the men doing the carrying had started quietly to read. That's what Corin was counting on. He didn't ambush anybody. He walked out onto the 19th gallery floor in a bloodied tunic and said, at a completely conversational volume, "The 11th crate on your left is the medical section. Anything with a green cord is a fever text. If any of you have somebody at home with the coughing sickness, the corrected draft is in the 3rd volume from the top, and it costs nothing to copy, and I'd take it now, because in about an hour this is all going to be on fire." 40 enforcers turned around, and roughly a dozen of them looked involuntarily at the crate on their left. "Don't listen to him," said Varric Kest. "Second seat, how many of your family are order? That is not. None of theirs are. Enforcers are recruited from the towns. That's policy. It's in the order's own charter, 9th article, because townsmen are cheaper and grateful. So every man in this gallery has a mother in a village somewhere, paying 40 silver for a draft that doesn't work. I'm not asking you to fight for me. I'm asking you to carry books out instead of in. That's all. Same job, opposite direction." Nobody moved. Then a man near the back, 31 years old, enormous, with a scar on his jaw, put down the crate he was holding and said, "Cart boy." And Corin's face did something complicated. "Hello, Bram," he said. There's a version of this story where that's the moment the whole room turns, and everyone cheers, and it's very satisfying and completely fake. What actually happened is that 9 of the 40 put their crates down, and the other 31 didn't, and Varric Kest gave an order. And there was a fight in the 19th gallery of the Undercroft, and it was ugly and confused and nothing like a Manhwa panel. Corin got 4 seconds and used them, and then somebody put him into a bookcase and he stayed there. Bram Kell, the boy who couldn't do the standing water form, dismissed from the initiates in the spring, held the stairwell to the 18th gallery on his own for about 90 seconds, which was long enough, because 90 seconds was how long it took Seller Wren and Eileen Farrow to come down the eastern shaft behind Corin. 4th seat, 3rd seat, both performing techniques as they were originally written and correctly finished in an enclosed space against men using versions with the keystones cut out. It lasted under a minute. Nobody died. That mattered to Corin later. Varric Kest was the last one standing, and he had a lamp in his hand, and he was 11 feet from the oil store. He looked at the 3 of them and made the calculation that clever men make when they've lost. "You've destroyed the order," he said. "Yes," said Corin from the floor. "You realize there'll be nothing. No standards, no licensing, any fool with a copy. Any fool with a copy will have the finished version, which is the first time in 300 years that's been true." Corin got an elbow under himself. "You're not wrong that it'll be chaos, Kest. It'll be a mess for 20 years. I've read about 11 of these. They're always a mess." He got his head up. "But nobody's going to die of the coughing sickness in a country that has the cure written on a wall." Varric Kest looked at the lamp in his hand for a long moment. Then he set it down, very carefully, on the floor and sat down next to it. Because he was a bookkeeper at heart, and he had finally run the numbers. They did not distribute the archive. That was the plan for about a day, and then Corin worked out that distribution is just licensing with better manners. Somebody decides who gets a copy, and somebody is always the order eventually. So instead, on the 9th day of summer, the Vellum Order opened the Undercroft, not symbolically. They took the iron door off its hinges and carried it down the mountain, and it sat in the grass at the bottom of the path for years afterward, rusting, with children climbing on it. Anyone could come in. Anyone could read. Anyone could copy and take the copy and sell the copy, and nobody owed anybody a coin. 4,000 people had come up that road with lanterns to stop it burning. 11,000 came the following month with paper. They called it the Great Copying, and it went on for 9 years, and it is the single largest transfer of knowledge in recorded history. carried out almost entirely by farmers, apothecaries, midwives, bricklayers, and out-of-work scribes sitting on the floors of 19 galleries, writing until their hands cramped. The corrected volumes went first, obviously. Medicine went fastest. The fever draft was on the wall of every apothecary in the eastern provinces before the first snow. The coughing sickness, the one that took Corin's mother and father, the one that killed 4,000 people in the 10 years he was inside, stopped being a thing people died of within 4 years. Not reduced, stopped. That's the payoff, not a fight. A ditch weed and a piece of paper and 11,000 people with pens. Bram Kell never rejoined the order, because by then there wasn't one worth joining. He went home and taught the standing water form, the real one, to anyone who turned up in the yard behind his forge. He was a mediocre martial artist for the whole of his life, and one of the best teachers of his generation. And he understood, better than anybody, exactly what it does to a person to be told for 14 months that they are stupid when the book is wrong. Sella Wren was offered the grandmastery twice and refused it twice. She took the only title that was ever invented for her, which was Reader of the First Gallery, and which meant in practice that she stood at the door of a mountain for 11 years and taught anybody who walked up the path. Thousands of people, no fees, no ranks. Her mother, who had scrubbed floors in the East Wing for 30 years, sat in on the first class. And Corin Vale went back to work. That's the ending, and if it sounds anticlimactic, you haven't been paying attention. He was 995 years old. He had corrected 60,000 volumes, broken a 300-year monopoly, ended a plague, and given an empire its own history back. And he was, by any measure a person actually lives by, completely unequipped for the world he'd fixed. He could not sit through a meal with strangers. Crowds made him ill for years. He never entirely lost the tendency, mid-conversation, to answer a dead engineer instead. So he did the thing he was for, he read. New books now, the ones the copying was producing by the thousand, written by people who had walked into a mountain and found out what their trade was supposed to be. Farming texts, bridge surveys, 19 different apothecaries' notes on what the Silverleaf draft did in different climates. All wrong, of course. All new and enthusiastic and full of errors, because that is what new knowledge is. He read them twice. He corrected them and put them on the shelf and took down the next one. Which brings us to the last day of this story, and to the thing in the 19th gallery. It was 4 years after the door came off. Corin reached for a volume on tidal engineering that he had corrected himself in his 611th year. There was a second sheet folded inside it. Corrections, 9 of them. Precise, elegant, and right, 3 of them addressing errors Corin had introduced himself. Because 1,000 years is a long time, and he was not a machine, and he had always known there would be mistakes in his own work. They were not in his handwriting. The ink was less than a year old. Corin Vale stood in the 19th gallery for a very long time. Then he went to the 7th gallery and took down a builder's survey of the mountain from before the Vellum Order existed. The one with the load-bearing notes and the water table and the footnote about what the vault does to time. He held the survey next to the folded sheet. Same hand. The survey was 411 years old. The ink on the sheet was still fresh enough to smudge. There was a note with it, on the back in that same steady hand, and it said 4 things. You did 60,000. This mountain is the first room of 9. The others are still sealed, and the doors only open from inside. Take your time, you have it. And underneath, not signed, because names are the one thing that never survives 400 years. Just a single line that Corin had read once before, in the 4th year of his sentence, carved into the underside of a shelf on the 17th gallery, in a place where only somebody wedging themselves into a 14-inch shaft would ever see it. The second reading is not the last one. Corin Vale sat down on the floor of a library with a note in his hand and did the only arithmetic that mattered. 9 rooms, 60,000 volumes each, give or take, 1,000 years apiece. He was 19 years old, and the eastern shaft was still open, and it had never once been a way out. It had always been a door, and somewhere on the other side of a mountain, somebody who had been waiting 400 years for a second reader had finally, patiently, gone back to work.